On a morning in the late spring of 1769, in a tall, narrow house on a quiet street in Ajaccio, a woman who had walked 2 miles home from church went into labor. The house was stone. The walls were thick and cool in the way that Mediterranean walls are, holding the previous night's chill long into the afternoon. Outside, the air smelled of salt and dry scrub and the faintly resinous sweetness of maqui, that low, dense tangle of rosemary and myrtle and wild lavender that covers the Corsican hills like a rough blanket. The woman's name was Letizia. She was 19 years old. She had already buried one child and born another, a son named Giuseppe, and now she was bringing a second son into a world that had, only 15 months earlier, changed forever beneath her feet. The island on which she labored had been, for most of its recorded history, a possession of the Republic of Genoa. Then, briefly and violently, it had been something close to independent, a small, fierce republic of its own, led by a man named Pasquale Paoli, who had written a constitution, organized a government, and for a few shining years made Corsica the subject of admiring attention from philosophers across Europe. Rousseau praised it. Boswell visited it. Voltaire took notice. And then, in 1768, Genoa sold the island to France, and France sent an army to enforce the purchase. And at the Battle of Ponte Novo in May of 1769, just 3 months before the boy was born, the Corsican resistance was crushed. Paoli fled to England. The dream of Corsican independence was over before it had properly begun. The child arrived on the 15th of August. He was small. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable in appearance, dark-haired, sharp-featured, thin. His family baptized him Napoleon di Buonaparte, a name that was Italian in every syllable, because the family spoke Italian, because Corsica's culture was Italian, because the Frenchness of the island was a political fact imposed from the outside, not yet absorbed into the bone. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer of minor noble standing, a man with ambitions slightly larger than his means, who had fought alongside Paoli and then, with the pragmatism that would prove hereditary, made his peace with the new French administration. His mother, Letizia, was a woman whose iron constitution and relentless discipline would become the stuff of family legend. She managed the household. She managed the money. She managed eventually a brood of 8 surviving children with a ferocity that none of them, not even the one who would command the largest armies in European history, ever quite learned to resist. The boy's name was Napoleone, and within the span of a single lifetime, a life of only 51 years, he would rise from this house, from this island, from this obscure and recently conquered corner of the Mediterranean, to command armies of 500,000 men, to redraw the map of Europe with his sword and his pen, to topple dynasties that had endured for centuries, to write laws that are still obeyed today in countries he never visited, and to give his name to an entire era of human civilization. Sure, he would be crowned emperor, he would be exiled, he would escape, reconquer his empire in 3 weeks without firing a shot, lose it again at a single battle, and die on a rock in the South Atlantic, dictating his memoirs to the ocean wind. He was the most improbable ruler in modern European history. He was also, by certain measures, the most consequential. This is the story of how a boy from a Corsican backwater became the master of Europe, and then lost it, and then took it back, and then lost it again, this time for good. It is a story about genius and its limits, about ambition and its costs, about the gap between what a single extraordinary mind can build and what the material world will permit to stand. It is a story about war and law and revolution and the strange alchemy by which historical accidents become historical inevitabilities. And it begins here in a stone house on a conquered island with a child who had no reason to expect that history would remember his name. Before we enter the life, we should pause briefly to consider how we know what we know about it. The historical record surrounding Napoleon Bonaparte is, by the standards of pre-modern biography, extraordinarily dense. He is one of the most documented human beings who ever lived. His personal correspondence alone runs to more than 30,000 letters, compiled and published across multiple decades in a monumental edition begun under Napoleon III. He dictated memoirs during his exile on St. Helena, sprawling, self-serving, brilliantly constructed accounts that shaped every subsequent telling of his story, including inevitably this one. His secretaries, his marshals, his valets, his wives, his enemies, his doctors, nearly everyone who spent significant time in his presence eventually wrote something down about it. The result is a documentary record of almost overwhelming volume. And yet, volume is not the same thing as reliability. Napoleon was, among his many talents, one of the great propagandists of the modern era. He understood earlier and more clearly than almost any figure of his century that the story told about events mattered as much as the events themselves. His bulletins from the battlefield were masterpieces of selective truth. His memoirs were instruments of legacy construction. He knew he was writing for posterity, and he wrote accordingly. The challenge for anyone attempting to reconstruct his life is not a shortage of material. It is the question of how much of the material was designed, from the moment of its creation, to deceive. The principal primary sources for the period we are about to cover, his childhood and early career, are thinner than what follows. For his youth on Corsica and his years at military school, we rely on a handful of letters, some school records, the later reminiscences of classmates and teachers recorded decades after the fact, and Napoleon's own retrospective accounts, which are colored by everything he became. For the revolutionary period, the sources thicken considerably. Military dispatches, government records, the correspondence of colleagues and rivals, the emerging Parisian press. We also have the work of modern historians, scholars like Philip Dwyer, whose meticulous 2-volume biography draws on archival research across half a dozen countries, and Andrew Roberts, whose single-volume life benefits from the recent digitization of Napoleon's complete correspondence, making it possible for the first time to read letters that had been scattered across private collections for 2 centuries. Stephen England's work on Napoleon's political identity and Patrice Guinefet's study of his path to power offer essential analytical frameworks. What we cannot do, what no amount of documentation permits, is see inside the boy's head as he sat in a cold dormitory in northeastern France, far from home, speaking a language that was not his own, reading about the lives of great men and wondering whether such a life might be possible for him. We can infer, we can reconstruct, we can with care imagine, but we cannot know. What we can do is tell the story as honestly as the sources permit, noting where they conflict, where they fall silent, and where the man himself was almost certainly lying. And we should begin where all such stories must begin, not with the person, but with the world that produced him. To understand what Napoleon became, you must first understand the place that made him, and the place that made him was not France. Corsica in the 18th century was a world apart. The island sits in the western Mediterranean, roughly 100 miles southeast of the French coast, closer to the Italian mainland than to Marseille, close enough to Sardinia that on clear days you could see its mountains from the southern capes. It is not a large island or riviere, roughly 114 miles long, perhaps 52 miles wide at its broadest point, but it is astonishingly vertical. The interior is a fortress of granite and schist, peaks rising above 8,000 feet. Draped in dense forests of pine and chestnut and the impenetrable maquis that gives the landscape its smell and its character. The coastline is indented, rocky, scattered with small harbors and coves that for centuries had served as havens for fishermen and pirates, in roughly equal measure. The people of the island were, in the language of every outside observer who encountered them, proud, clannish, violent, and poor. These are the words of colonizers describing the colonized, and they should be handled with appropriate skepticism, but they are not entirely wrong. Corsican society in this period was organized around the family, the village, and the vendetta. Disputes between families could persist across generations. Banditry was endemic. the central authority of whichever foreign power nominally controlled the island, Genoa, then France, penetrated the interior only fitfully. The economy was agricultural, subsistence level in the mountains, slightly more prosperous along the coasts where olive oil and chestnuts could be exported. There was no significant manufacturing. There was no university. The minor nobility to which the Bonaparte family belonged was a thin stratum. Families who could claim some ancestral distinction and perhaps a modest income from land, but who lived in conditions that a French or English aristocrat would have found laughable. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, was a representative specimen of this class. He had studied law at the University of Pisa, which gave him a veneer of continental sophistication. He had joined Paoli's independence movement as a young man, which gave him nationalist credentials. And when the French arrived and the cause was lost, he had pivoted, smoothly, quickly, without evident anguish, to collaboration with the new regime. He cultivated French officials. He obtained recognition of his family's noble status from the French authorities, a crucial step that would allow his sons access to the scholarships reserved for the children of the French minor nobility. He was, in short, an operator, a man who understood that in a conquered territory, survival required flexibility, and advancement required the willingness to become, at least on paper, something other than what you were. Letizia, by contrast, seems to have been made of less negotiable material. The sources, mostly later, mostly filtered through the family mythology, describe a woman of relentless discipline, physical toughness, and financial caution. She had accompanied Carlo on campaign during the war against France, reportedly while pregnant with Napoleon. She bore 13 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. She managed a household of limited means with an austerity that bordered on severity. Napoleon would later say, with what appears to be genuine respect, that he owed everything to his mother. The remark may have been calculated, but it was not implausible. In a family full of charm and ambition, Letizia was the spine. Into this household, Italian-speaking, Corsican in identity, French by recent and reluctant political affiliation, Napoleone arrived, the second surviving son, neither the heir nor the afterthought. He was, by the fragmentary accounts of his childhood, a difficult child, solitary, quick-tempered, given to fights with his older brother Giuseppe that Letizia had to break up with her hands. He preferred numbers to people. He liked to be alone. He read. He was not yet anyone. The transformation began in January of 1779, when Napoleon was 9 years old. Carlo Bonaparte, leveraging every connection he had cultivated with the French administration, secured places for 2 of his sons at schools on the French mainland. Giuseppe, the eldest, was sent to the seminary at Autun to prepare for a career in the church. Napoleon was sent to the Royal Military Academy at Brienne-le-Château, a small town in the Champagne region of northeastern France, roughly 500 miles from Ajaccio, a distance that in the 18th century might as well have been measured in light years. Consider what this meant. A 9-year-old boy, raised in a sun-drenched Mediterranean culture where family was everything and clan loyalty was the organizing principle of existence, was deposited in a gray stone institution in one of the coldest, dampest, flattest regions of northern France, surrounded by the sons of French aristocrats who regarded Corsicans as barely civilized, who mocked his accent, his name, his height, his poverty, and his foreignness. The language of instruction was French. The boy's French, at the time of his arrival, was rudimentary at best. He would never fully lose the Corsican accent that marked every French word he spoke for the rest of his life. The loneliness must have been comprehensive. The sources for his years at Brienne are limited. Scattered recollections from classmates published decades later, when the boy they had mocked had become the most powerful man in Europe, and the temptation to embellish was considerable. But certain details recur with enough consistency to suggest a core of truth. He was isolated. He was proud. He did not make friends easily, and when friendships formed, they were with other outsiders, boys from the margins of the French world, boys who understood what it meant to be tolerated rather than welcomed. He was small for his age and remained small, never growing taller than about 5 feet 6 or 7 inches, average for the period, though the legend of his shortness would prove more durable than the reality. What he did in the absence of social belonging was read. He read voraciously, compulsively, with the particular hunger of a child who has found in books a world more hospitable than the one he physically inhabits. He read Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, those parallel biographies of great men that had shaped the self-image of educated Europeans for centuries, and something in them ignited. He read Caesar's commentaries. He read about Alexander. He read histories of warfare and treatises on artillery. He filled notebooks, pages and pages in a cramped, barely legible hand that would torment his secretaries for the rest of his career, with observations, calculations, and summaries. He was not, by the accounts of his teachers, an exceptional student in most subjects. His Latin was poor, his spelling was erratic, his handwriting was atrocious. But in mathematics and in the technical subjects related to artillery, ballistics, geometry, the physics of projectiles, he excelled. He excelled because these subjects rewarded the kind of mind he had, precise, spatial, relentlessly analytical, capable of holding multiple variables in simultaneous relation. There is a pattern here that bears noting, because it will repeat throughout his life. Napoleon did not succeed by being well-rounded. He succeeded by being spectacularly, disproportionately good at a small number of things: calculation, speed, the ability to read a situation and act before others had finished thinking, and by operating in environments where those specific abilities were the ones that mattered most. At Brienne, mathematics and artillery were the subjects that mattered. In the revolution that was coming, speed and decisiveness would be the qualities that mattered. On the battlefields of Italy and Austria, tactical vision and the ability to move faster than the enemy would be the qualities that mattered. He was not a universal genius. He was a specialist of devastating effectiveness who had the extraordinary fortune, or the extraordinary instinct at Caesar, to find himself again and again in situations where his particular specialization was exactly what was required. He spent 5 years at Brienne. In 1784, at the age of 15, he was selected for transfer to the École Militaire in Paris, the premier military academy in France, where he would complete his training as an artillery officer. He arrived in the capital at a hinge moment in European history, though he could not have known it. The French monarchy was drowning in debt. The aristocracy was paralyzed by its own privileges. The intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment had raised questions about authority, legitimacy, and the rights of man that the existing political order had no mechanism to answer. The American Revolution, which France had helped finance, had demonstrated that a colonial people could overthrow their rulers and establish a republic. The example was noted in Paris, in the salons and the coffee houses, with a mixture of admiration and unease. Napoleon completed his studies at the École Militaire in a single year, an accelerated pace that reflected either his abilities or the institution's desire to move students through efficiently, or both. In September of 1785, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery regiment of La Fère, stationed at Valence in southeastern France. He was 16 years old. He was a junior officer in the army of a king he did not particularly admire, serving a country he did not particularly consider his own, in a military system that reserved its highest positions for men of ancient noble lineage, men who would have regarded a Corsican second lieutenant as furniture. France was 4 years away from revolution. He could not have known. Nobody could have known. The revolution, when it came fast. The causes have been debated for 2 centuries and will not be settled here. The short version is structural. France in the 1780s was the richest and most populous country in Western Europe, governed by a political system designed for the 13th century and funded by a tax structure so irrational, so riddled with exemptions and privileges that even its beneficiaries recognized it as unsustainable. The monarchy was spending more than it collected. The aristocracy refused to be taxed. The middle classes, lawyers, merchants, professionals, the people the French called the bourgeoisie, had wealth and education but no political voice. The peasantry, who constituted the vast majority of the population, bore the heaviest tax burden and had the least to show for it. And the harvest of 1788 had failed, which meant that bread prices in Paris were climbing toward levels that made hunger not a metaphor, but a daily reality for hundreds of thousands of people. In May of 1789, the king convened the Estates General, an ancient consultative body that had not met since 1614, in a desperate attempt to find a political solution to the fiscal crisis. Within weeks, the representatives of the Third Estate, the commoners, had declared themselves a national assembly. Within months, the Bastille had fallen. The Declaration of the Rights of Man had been issued, and the feudal privileges of the aristocracy had been formally abolished. Within 4 years, the king himself would be dead, executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, and France would be a republic at war with most of Europe. Where was Napoleon during all of this? He was watching. He was reading. He was characteristically taking notes. In the first years of the Revolution, Napoleon was a young officer on leave more often than on duty, spending long stretches on Corsica, entangled in the factional politics of his home island. He supported the revolution, most junior officers did, but his primary political identity was still Corsican rather than French. He aligned himself with Paoli, who had returned from English exile to lead the island, and for a time it seemed possible that Napoleon's future might be that of a Corsican political figure, a local leader in a local drama, unconnected to the continental convulsions unfolding across the water. But Corsica proved too small for him, or perhaps he proved too French for Corsica, or perhaps, and this is the most plausible reading, the factional dynamics of island politics simply broke against him. Paoli and the Buonaparte family fell out. The break was bitter and decisive. In June of 1793, the entire Bonaparte clan was driven from Corsica. They fled to the French mainland as refugees, arriving in Toulon with little money and no clear future. It was a humiliation. It was also, in retrospect, the most fortunate catastrophe of Napoleon's life. Corsica had been a trap, a stage too small for his abilities, a world too governed by clan loyalties and personal grudges for his particular kind of intelligence to find its leverage. France, by contrast, was in chaos. And chaos, for a man of Napoleon's specific talents, was not a threat. It was a medium. The old French army had been an aristocratic institution. Commissions were purchased, promotions were determined by birth. A man of Napoleon's background, minor Corsican nobility, no connections, no money, no patron of consequence, could expect to spend decades as a junior officer watching less competent men rise above him because their surnames were older and their estates were larger. The revolution destroyed that system with the thoroughness of a fire through a timber house. By 1793, the old officer corps had been decimated. Some had emigrated, fleeing France to join the counter-revolutionary armies gathering on the borders. Some had been guillotined. Some had simply resigned, unwilling to serve a government they found abhorrent. The result was a vacuum, a vast, sudden, unprecedented opening at every level of military command. And into that vacuum rushed anyone with ability, nerve, and the political credentials to avoid the attention of the Committee of Public Safety. Napoleon had all three. The siege of Toulon gave him his chance. In the autumn of 1793, the port city of Toulon on the Mediterranean coast had declared against the revolutionary government and opened its harbor to the British Royal Navy. The Republic needed the city back. The army besieging it was poorly led and disorganized. Napoleon, then a 24-year-old captain of artillery, arrived with a plan. The plan was simple in conception and difficult in execution, which was Napoleon's signature throughout his career. He recognized that the key to Toulon was not the city itself, but the forts controlling the harbor. Take the forts, and the British fleet would be forced to withdraw. Without the fleet, the city could not hold. He identified the critical position of Corf, a promontory called Les Guillettes, and he argued, with the relentless insistence that would become another signature, that all available force should be concentrated on taking it. He was right. The assault succeeded. The British withdrew. Toulon fell. The episode is worth pausing over because it contains in miniature nearly everything that would characterize Napoleon's military career at its best. The ability to see the decisive point in a complex situation, to identify amid a welter of competing objectives and conflicting information the one thing that actually mattered, the willingness to concentrate force at that point regardless of risk, the physical courage. He was wounded in the thigh during the assault by a British bayonet and fought on, and the political instinct to ensure that the right people knew what he had done. The Republic promoted him to brigadier general. He was 24. 2 years later, he was in Paris, and Paris was in crisis again. The revolution had devoured its own leaders with mechanical regularity. Danton guillotined, Robespierre guillotined, faction after faction rising and falling in a cycle of paranoia and violence that had left the surviving political class exhausted and terrified. The government of the moment, the Directory, was weak, corrupt, and threatened from both sides, by royalists who wanted to restore the monarchy and by radicals who wanted to deepen the revolution. In October of 1795, a royalist insurrection broke out in Paris, and the mobs were heading for the seat of government. The Directory needed someone who could stop them. They needed someone with cannons and the willingness to use them on a crowd. They found Napoleon. What happened next took less than an hour. He positioned his artillery at the approaches to the Tuileries and ordered his gunners to fire grape shot, canisters packed with iron balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun, into the advancing columns of royalist insurgents. The effect was immediate and devastating. The insurrection collapsed. The streets cleared. Napoleon described the event with characteristic economy. A whiff of grape shot, he called it. The phrase is famous. It is also revealing. The word whiff suggests something trivial, something almost elegant, a scent on the breeze, a passing sensation. What it actually describes is the killing of several hundred Parisian civilians with artillery fire at close range in the streets of their own city. This is the gap, the moral gap, the rhetorical gap that runs through Napoleon's entire career like a fault line. The brilliance of the language and the horror of the act held together in a single sentence, neither canceling the other. The Directory was grateful. They gave him command of the army of Italy. He was 26 years old. He had no money. He had no social standing. He had no powerful family behind him. What he had was a reputation, a plan, and an army waiting for him in the south of France. He married Josephine de Beauharnais 2 days before he left for the front. She was a 32-year-old widow with 2 children, 6 years his senior, elegant, worldly, well-connected, and not, if the sources are to be believed, particularly in love with him. He was infatuated with her to a degree that bordered on obsession. The letters he wrote to her from Italy are among the most passionate in the history of wartime correspondence, burning, jealous, desperate, embarrassing in their nakedness. She answered infrequently and with evident coolness. It was from the beginning an asymmetry. He loved her more than she loved him. She needed him more than she wanted him. The marriage would survive infidelity, political calculation, and the pressure of empire before finally breaking on the question that broke so many dynastic marriages. She could not give him an heir. But all of that was in the future. In March of 1796, Brigadier General Napoleon Bonaparte, he had begun Gallicizing the name, shedding the Italian vowels one by one, as if reshaping his identity letter by letter, arrived at his new command in Nice and found an army that was, by the standards of the French Republic, typical. Brave, experienced, revolutionary in spirit, and falling apart. The soldiers were unpaid, their uniforms were rags, their boots were disintegrating, their supply lines were theoretical. Their previous commanders had achieved little. The Austrian and Sardinian armies facing them across the Alpine passes were better equipped, better supplied, and more numerous. Napoleon looked at the situation. He looked at the map. He saw what others had not seen or had not dared to act on. He saw the gap. The enemy forces were divided. The Sardinians to the west, the Austrians to the east, separated by a stretch of mountainous terrain through which a fast-moving army could drive like a wedge, preventing them from uniting. If he moved quickly enough, he could defeat them in detail, first one then the other, before either could receive reinforcement. Speed, concentration, the decisive point. He moved. And what followed? In the hills of Piedmont, in the plains of Lombardy, across the bridges and rivers and walled towns of northern Italy, was a campaign that announced to Europe with the force of a cannon shot that something new had arrived in the world. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 lasted roughly a year. In that year, Napoleon fought 12 major battles, won 11 of them, knocked Sardinia out of the war in 2 weeks, drove the Austrians out of northern Italy, and imposed a peace on the Habsburg Empire that redrew the political map of the peninsula. He was 27 years old when it began. He was 28 when it ended. And by the time it was over, he was no longer a promising young general. He was the most famous man in France. The details of the campaign repay close attention because they reveal not just what Napoleon could do, but how he did it. The operational logic that made his style of warfare for a period of roughly 15 years the most effective in Europe. The first principle was speed. Napoleon moved his armies faster than anyone his opponents had encountered. This was not because his soldiers were fitter or his horses were swifter. It was because he made decisions faster, issued orders faster, and tolerated less deliberation at every level of command. Where an Austrian general might spend 3 days reconnoitering a position, consulting his staff, requesting guidance from Vienna, and positioning his forces with meticulous care, Napoleon would assess the situation, identify his objective, and march. Often before dawn, often on empty stomachs, often on roads that his engineers declared unsuitable. His soldiers marched on average 12 to 15 miles a day. In critical moments, they covered 25. The Austrians could not comprehend this. They would prepare to meet him at a position they judged 2 days distant, and he would arrive in 1. The second principle was concentration of force at the decisive point. Napoleon almost never had numerical superiority across an entire theater of operations. What he had was the ability to read a battlefield, or a map, and identify the single point where force would have disproportionate effect. Then he would strip his flanks, accept risk elsewhere, and mass everything he had at that point. It was in essence a form of gambling, but gambling informed by a spatial intelligence so acute that it often felt to those on the receiving end like something closer to clairvoyance. The third principle was the central position. When facing 2 enemy armies that had not yet joined, Napoleon would place himself between them, forcing each to fight him alone. This was the geometry of the Italian campaign in its purest form. The Sardinians and the Austrians were allies, but they had different objectives and different lines of retreat. Napoleon drove between them at Montenotte, widened the gap at Dago and Millesimo, and within 12 days had forced Sardinia to sign an armistice. Then he turned east toward the Austrians and pursued them across Lombardy. The battles themselves were brutal, confused, and often far closer than the narrative of Napoleonic invincibility would suggest. At Lodi in May of 1796, Napoleon personally led a charge across a bridge under Austrian cannon fire, an act of physical courage that was either reckless or calculated, depending on whether you believe he had assessed the Austrian guns as poorly positioned or simply did not care. His soldiers, who had regarded him with skepticism upon his arrival, this small, thin, oddly intense young man who looked like a student and talked like a professor, began to call him le petit caporal, the little corporal, a term of rough affection that acknowledged both his size and his willingness to share their danger. Lodi mattered to Napoleon for reasons beyond the tactical. He said later, much later, on St. Helena, with the self-mythologizing instinct that colored everything he said about himself, that it was at Lodi that he first conceived the idea that he might become a decisive political figure. "I saw the world recede beneath me," he reportedly said, "as if I were being carried into the sky. The language is grandiose. the sentiment may nonetheless be true. Something shifted at Lodi. The young artillery officer who had been content to serve the Republic began to imagine himself as something more than an instrument of others' authority. He took Milan. He took Mantua, after a siege that dragged through the autumn and winter, during which the Austrians sent no fewer than 4 separate relief armies, each of which Napoleon defeated in turn, at Castiglione, at Arcole, at Rivoli, in a sequence of battles that reads, on the page, like a military textbook, and must have felt, in the mud and the smoke, like a recurring nightmare that kept ending in improbable victory. Arcole deserves a moment. The battle, fought over 3 days in November of 1796, centered on a small bridge over a marshy stream called the Alpone. The French needed to cross. The Austrians were dug in on the far side. The first assault failed, the second failed. On the third attempt, Napoleon himself seized a flag and advanced onto the bridge under fire, trying to rally his men by personal example. He was nearly killed, pushed into the marsh by the press of retreating bodies, dragged out by his aides, and the bridge was still not taken. He found another way across, turned the Austrian flank, and won the battle by a method entirely different from the frontal heroics that produced the famous painting. This distinction matters. The painting, Napoleon on the bridge at Arcole, flag in hand, face ablaze with revolutionary fervor, became one of the defining images of his legend. It was painted by Antoine-Jean Gros, and it shows a man in the act of leading a charge that in reality failed. The actual victory was won not by dash, but by maneuver, not by the gesture, but by the calculation that followed it. Napoleon understood from very early on that both were necessary, the gesture for the legend, the calculation for the result, and that the art of power lay in making people believe they were the same thing. By January of 1797, the Austrians had exhausted their willingness to fight for northern Italy. Napoleon advanced into Austria itself, pushing through the Alpine passes toward Vienna, and the Habsburgs sued for peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October, was negotiated by Napoleon personally. Not by diplomats, not by the Directory in Paris, but by a 28-year-old general who had decided without authorization that he was competent to reshape the map of Europe. And reshape it he did. The Austrian Netherlands, where roughly modern Belgium seconds, were ceded to France. A new entity called the Cisalpine Republic was created in northern Italy, nominally independent, actually a French client state with a constitution that Napoleon drafted himself. Venice, a republic that had endured for 1,000 years, was partitioned, half given to Austria, half absorbed into the new order. With a casualness that suggested Napoleon regarded a millennium of Venetian independence as an administrative inconvenience. The Directory in Paris watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and alarm. Napoleon had won them their war. He had also demonstrated with unmistakable clarity that he was operating beyond their control. He negotiated treaties they had not authorized. He created republics they had not approved. He sent looted art back to Paris. Crate after crate of Italian masterpieces, the cultural patrimony of the peninsula, packed up and shipped north as the spoils of revolutionary liberation. And the gesture was at once a gift and a threat. "Look what I can give you," the shipment said. "Imagine what I might take." He returned to Paris in December of 1797, and the city received him as something between a hero and a demigod. The government gave him a ceremonial sword. The salons fought over his attendance. The newspapers printed his image. He was, for a brief and intoxicating moment, the most popular man in a country where popularity was the only currency that reliably held its value. But he could not stay. Popularity in revolutionary Paris was a volatile substance. It could sustain you or it could fuel your enemies, and the half-life was short. The Directory feared him too much to employ him in a domestic capacity and needed him too much to ignore him entirely. A compromise was reached, though whether it originated with Napoleon or with the directors who wanted him far from Paris is one of those questions the sources do not conclusively resolve. He would go to Egypt. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 to 1799 is one of the strangest episodes in Napoleon's career, and in some ways one of the most revealing. Its stated objective was strategic: to threaten British interests in India by establishing a French presence in the eastern Mediterranean, severing the trade routes that sustained British commercial power in Asia. Its actual motivations were more complex and more personal. Napoleon was drawn to the East with an almost romantic fascination. He had read about Alexander's conquests, about the pharaohs, about the civilizations that had risen and fallen along the Nile, and something in him responded to the scale of it, the antiquity, the sheer otherness. He brought with him not only 36,000 soldiers, but 167 scholars, mathematicians, naturalists, engineers, linguists, antiquarians, in what amounted to a military invasion staffed with an attached research university. The duality is characteristic. Napoleon conquered Egypt, and he studied it. His soldiers fought the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids, and his scholars measured the Sphinx. The campaign produced the Rosetta Stone, the key that would eventually unlock the hieroglyphic script and open the ancient Egyptian world to modern understanding. It also produced massacres at Jaffa, where Napoleon ordered the execution of several thousand Ottoman prisoners because he could not feed them and could not release them, a decision that was militarily rational and morally indefensible, and which he spent the rest of his life attempting to minimize. The Jaffa massacre warrants direct examination because it illuminates the moral architecture of Napoleon's command with particular clarity. The city had resisted a French siege. When it fell, Napoleon's soldiers sacked it with a violence that exceeded anything he had sanctioned: rape, looting, killing that went on for hours. In the aftermath, some 3,000 to 4,000 Ottoman prisoners were taken. They could not be paroled. They would simply rejoin the enemy. They could not be fed. The army supplies were already insufficient. They could not be guarded. Every soldier assigned to guard prisoners was a soldier unavailable for combat. Napoleon deliberated for several days. Then he ordered them marched to the beach and shot. Some accounts say bayoneted to save ammunition. The men who carried out the order did not do so willingly. Several of Napoleon's own officers protested. The soldiers who pulled the triggers or thrust the bayonets were reportedly shaken. The prisoners, according to witnesses, died in groups, some trying to escape into the surf, some standing in silence, some screaming. Napoleon never expressed public remorse. In his later accounts, he framed the decision as a necessity imposed by circumstances, a terrible but unavoidable act in a campaign where the rules of European warfare did not apply. The framing was self-serving. It was also within the brutal logic of 18th century military operations in the Levant, not entirely dishonest. Other commanders in other centuries had faced similar dilemmas and reached similar conclusions. This does not excuse the act. It locates it in a pattern in which the exigencies of command routinely produce outcomes that are individually horrifying and systemically comprehensible. The Egyptian campaign, viewed from a distance, was a strategic failure. The French fleet that had carried Napoleon's army to Alexandria was destroyed by the British at the Battle of the Nile in August of 1798. Horatio Nelson's great victory, which left the French army stranded in Egypt with no reliable way home. Napoleon won his battles on land, the pyramids, Mount Tabor, Abu Qir, but he could not win the campaign because the campaign depended on naval supremacy he did not possess and could not achieve. The army he had brought to Egypt would eventually surrender to the British, years after he had left it, and he did leave it. This is the detail that Napoleon's admirers tend to hurry past, and his critics tend to linger over. In August of 1799, having received news that the military and political situation in Europe had deteriorated catastrophically, French armies were losing on multiple fronts, the Directory was collapsing, a new coalition of European powers was threatening to undo everything the revolution had gained. Napoleon slipped away from Egypt on a fast frigate, leaving his army behind under the command of General Kleber. He told his soldiers he was going to get reinforcements. He was going to get power. The return voyage took 47 days. threading through a Mediterranean patrolled by British warships. That he made it at all was a function of luck and seamanship. That he made it in time was a function of the calendar aligning with his ambition. He landed at Fréjus on October 9th, 1799. France was waiting for him, though not in the way a country waits for a returning hero. France was waiting for him in the way a patient waits for a surgeon, with a mixture of hope, desperation, and the dull awareness that the procedure might kill them. The Coup of 18 Brumaire. November 9th, 1799, in the revolutionary calendar that the Republic had imposed as part of its project to rebuild time itself, was not elegant. Napoleon and his co-conspirators, principally the political operator Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, planned to dissolve the Directory and replace it with a new government, a consulate of 3 members, with Napoleon as first consul. The legal mechanism was a staged crisis. The legislature would be told that a Jacobin plot threatened the Republic, would be persuaded to move its sessions to the suburban palace of Saint-Cloud for safety, and there, isolated from the Paris crowd, would be pressured into voting itself out of existence. The first day went roughly according to plan. The second day nearly collapsed into farce. When Napoleon appeared before the Council of 500, the lower house of the legislature, to demand their compliance, the deputies erupted. They shouted him down. They surrounded him. Some reportedly grabbed him by the collar. Napoleon, who was capable of preternatural calm on a battlefield, appears to have panicked in the chamber. He stammered. He made incoherent threats. He may have scratched his own face in agitation. The sources are confused on this point, but the image of Napoleon clawing at his own skin while politicians screamed at him is too vivid and too widely attested to dismiss entirely. It was his brother Lucien who saved the coup. Lucien, who happened to be president of the Council of 500, went outside, told the soldiers guarding the building that the deputies inside were threatening the life of their general, and invited the troops to clear the chamber. The soldiers complied. The deputies scattered, some through doors, some through windows. Within hours, the Rump legislature had voted to establish the consulate, and Napoleon was effectively the ruler of France. The entire episode is instructive. Napoleon's genius was military and administrative. His instinct for the management of deliberative bodies, for the slow, compromising, procedurally constrained work of politics, was weak. Throughout his career, when confronted with opposition that could not be outflanked or outrun, he tended to falter. He could command armies. He could design legal codes. He could administer vast territories with a bureaucratic intensity that bordered on obsessive. But he could not persuade equals. He could not tolerate dissent. He could not operate within a system he did not control. This limitation would not matter for years, because for years he controlled every system he operated within. The consulate that emerged from the coup was, in theory, a government of 3 consuls sharing executive power. In practice, it was a monarchy in all but name, with Napoleon as the monarch. The Constitution of Exile, drafted largely by Napoleon himself, though Sieyès contributed the theoretical framework, concentrated power in the first consul to a degree that made the other 2 consuls ornamental. Napoleon could propose laws, appoint ministers, command the army, and conduct foreign policy. The legislature existed to ratify his decisions, not to make them. He submitted the new constitution to a plebiscite, a popular vote that served as both democratic legitimation and political theater. The result, announced in February of 1800, was overwhelming. More than 3 million votes in favor, roughly 1,500 against. The numbers were fraudulent. The interior minister, Lucien Bonaparte, inflated them considerably, but even the real totals would have shown massive support. France was exhausted. France wanted stability, competence, and an end to the chaos that had defined the previous decade. Napoleon offered all 3, and the price, the surrender of genuine democratic governance, was one that most French citizens in 1800 were willing to pay. Whether they understood what they were paying for is another question. What Napoleon did with power once he had it is in some ways more remarkable than how he obtained it. The temptation, when telling this story, is to rush toward the battles. toward Marengo and Austerlitz and the glittering sequence of military victories that defined the consulate and the early empire. The battles are dramatic. They are cinematic. They are what most people think of when they think of Napoleon, but to focus exclusively on the wars is to miss what may be Napoleon's most durable achievement and the one that most clearly separates him from the long line of talented generals who preceded and followed him. He rebuilt France. In the first 4 years of the consulate, from 1800 to 1804, before he crowned himself emperor, Napoleon undertook a program of institutional reform so comprehensive, so systematic, and so lasting that its effects are still visible in France today. The scope is difficult to overstate. He reformed the legal system, the educational system, the financial system, the administrative system, the relationship between church and state, and the infrastructure of the country, all simultaneously, all with a personal attention to detail that astonished his subordinates and exhausted his secretaries. The centerpiece was the Civil Code, promulgated in 1804 and known ever since as the Code Napoleon. It was not written by Napoleon alone. A commission of 4 distinguished jurists did the drafting, but he presided over 57 of the 102 sessions in which the code was debated, and his interventions were substantive, not ceremonial. He had opinions on inheritance law. He had opinions on property rights. He had opinions on marriage, divorce, paternal authority, and the legal status of women. Some of those opinions were progressive. The code established equality before the law, abolished feudal privileges, and guaranteed religious tolerance. Some were reactionary. The code subordinated wives to husbands, restricted women's property rights, and enshrined a patriarchal vision of family life that would take more than a century to fully dismantle. The code was, in other words, a document of its moment. Revolutionary in its rejection of aristocratic privilege, conservative in its embrace of bourgeois social order, modern in its systematic rationality, and deeply marked by the assumptions of a man who believed that society required hierarchy and that the natural hierarchy placed men above women, fathers above children, and property owners above everyone else. It was also, by any honest reckoning, a masterpiece of legal architecture. It was clear. It was comprehensive. It was portable. It was designed to be understood by citizens, not just by lawyers. It spread across Europe in the wake of Napoleon's armies, and it took root. Today, the legal systems of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Poland, Louisiana, Quebec, and large parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia bear its imprint. More human beings live under legal systems descended from the Code Napoleon than under any other legal tradition except the English common law. Napoleon knew this was his most important legacy. He said so explicitly on St. Helena, in one of those moments of retrospective clarity that punctuate his exile memoirs. "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will efface the memory of so many victories. What nothing will destroy, what will live eternally, is my civil code." He was right. He was also characteristically overstating the case remembrers. Waterloo has not been forgotten, and the code's legacy is considerably more ambiguous than he suggested. But the essential claim is sound. The code outlasted the empire. The code outlasted the man. The code outlasted the century. Beyond the code, Napoleon established the Bank of France, stabilizing a currency that the Revolution had debased into near worthlessness. He created the system of prefects, centrally appointed administrators who governed the departments of France with a uniformity and efficiency that replaced the chaotic patchwork of revolutionary local government. He founded the lycée system, the network of state secondary schools that educated the French elite for 2 centuries. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, ending a decade of religious conflict by restoring the Catholic Church's position in French life while ensuring that the state, not Rome, retained ultimate authority over ecclesiastical appointments and church property. Each of these reforms deserves its own examination. Taken together, they constitute the construction of the modern French state, a centralized, rationalized, bureaucratically administered entity that replaced both the Ancien regime's tangle of feudal privileges and the revolution's chaotic improvisation with something coherent, functional, and enduring. Napoleon did not invent every element of this system. Much of it built on revolutionary precedents, and some of it drew on pre-revolutionary administrative traditions, but he imposed coherence. He imposed speed. He imposed his own relentless, consuming attention, sitting in council sessions that lasted 10 and 12 hours, dictating correspondence at 4 in the morning, reviewing budgets and legal drafts and military dispatches in the same sitting, as if the administration of a nation were a problem in artillery, a matter of calculating trajectories, concentrating resources, and firing at the right moment. His capacity for work was, by all accounts, extraordinary. He slept 4 to 5 hours a night. He dictated to multiple secretaries simultaneously, switching between subjects, a letter to a general, a note on canal construction, a revision of a legal article, without apparent effort. He remembered numbers, names, unit strengths, and geographic details with a precision that unnerved his subordinates. He was, in the administrative sphere, what he was on the battlefield, a mind that processed information faster than those around him and acted on it before they had finished reading the briefing. The cost of this concentration was paid by everyone in his vicinity. He was a brutal employer. He berated ministers in public. He reduced subordinates to tears. He demanded absolute obedience and interpreted disagreement as disloyalty. His rages were famous, sudden, volcanic, sometimes calculated for effect, sometimes genuine. And the atmosphere around him was one of perpetual tension, relieved only by moments of startling charm when he chose to deploy it. He was building a state. He was also building a throne. The trajectory from first consul to emperor was not inevitable, but it had a certain geometric logic. Each step eliminated a constraint. Each reform concentrated power further. The consulate for life, established by plebiscite in 1802, removed the need for re-election. The creation of the Legion of Honor established a personal system of reward that bound the French elite to Napoleon individually, not to the Republic as an institution. The purge of potential rivals, the execution of the Duc d'Enghien in 1804, a Bourbon prince kidnapped from neutral territory and shot in a ditch on suspicion of conspiracy, eliminated the most visible symbol of dynastic opposition, while sending an unmistakable message to anyone who might consider challenging Napoleon's authority. The Enghien affair was a crime. There is no other honest word for it. A sovereign prince was seized on foreign soil, subjected to a sham trial, and executed on evidence that was, at best, circumstantial. The crowned heads of Europe were horrified. Talleyrand, Napoleon's own foreign minister, reportedly called it worse than a crime, a blunder, a phrase so perfectly calibrated that it has survived 2 centuries as a summary of the relationship between morality and statecraft. Napoleon never apologized. He never explained. He simply incorporated the act into his pattern of rule, decisive, extra-legal, and designed to demonstrate that the normal restraints did not apply to him. On December 2, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The Pope was present, Saint-Nouve. Pius VII had traveled from Rome for the occasion, but at the moment of crowning, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The gesture was not spontaneous, it was choreographed, and its meaning was unmistakable. He owed his crown to no one, not to God, not to the church, not to the people, not to the revolution that had made his rise possible. He had taken it himself, and he would wear it on his own terms. The boy from Ajaccio was emperor. The stone house in Corsica was a long way below him now and getting further by the day, but the wars were not over. They were, in fact, about to reach a scale that Europe had not seen since the fall of Rome. The coalition that formed against him in 1805 through the Third Coalition, in the numbering that historians use to track Europe's repeated attempts to contain France, was born of the same mixture of fear, calculation, and wounded pride that had produced its predecessors, Britain, which had never made peace with Napoleonic France except in the brief and mutually insincere interlude of the Treaty of Amiens, was the coalition's banker and its strategic anchor. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, was its largest military contributor, a young emperor, idealistic and impressionable, who regarded Napoleon with a fascination that would curdle over the coming decade into something closer to obsession. Austria, humiliated by the losses of the 1790s, was its most reluctant member, driven back into war less by enthusiasm than by the recognition that Napoleon's expanding power in Italy and Germany left the Habsburg Empire with a choice between resistance and irrelevance. Napoleon's initial plan had not been to fight Austria and Russia at all. His gaze, through the summer and autumn of 1805, had been fixed on England. At Boulogne, on the Channel coast, he had assembled the largest invasion force Europe had seen since the Spanish Armada. Nearly 200,000 men, more than 2,000 boats, an army trained, equipped, and positioned to cross the 21 miles of water that separated France from its most persistent enemy. The plan required one thing Napoleon could not command: naval superiority in the Channel, even temporarily. He needed his fleet, scattered between Brest, Toulon, and the Spanish ports, to concentrate, draw the British Navy away, and hold the crossing open long enough for the army to embark. The fleet never came. The combination of British naval dominance, French naval incompetence, and the sheer difficulty of coordinating a multi-fleet operation across thousands of miles of contested ocean defeated the plan before it could be attempted. Napoleon waited at Boulogne through the summer, growing increasingly frustrated, dictating furious letters to his admirals, watching the weather, watching the sea. The invasion of England, the one campaign that might have ended the wars decisively and on his terms, remained a possibility that narrowed with each passing week until it was no longer a possibility at all. And then, in August of 1805, he learned that Austria was mobilizing. He turned. The speed of what followed is difficult to comprehend without a map and a calendar. On August 27th, the Army of England, rechristened with characteristic Napoleonic flair as the Grande Armée, broke camp at Boulogne and began marching east. By late September, nearly 200,000 men had crossed France and reached the Rhine. By mid-October, they were in Bavaria, and the Austrian army that had advanced into that territory was in catastrophic trouble. The Ulm campaign, fought in the first 3 weeks of October 1805, is regarded by military historians as one of the most perfect strategic operations ever executed. It deserves the reputation. Napoleon identified that the Austrian General Mack had advanced his army to the city of Ulm on the Danube, expecting the French to approach from the west through the Black Forest. Instead, Napoleon swept his army in a vast wheeling movement to the north and east, crossing the Danube upstream of Ulm, cutting Mack's lines of communication, and encircling his entire force before the Austrian general fully understood what was happening. Mack surrendered on October 20th. Nearly 30,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their arms. The French had barely fought. The campaign had been won not by battle but by maneuver, by the application of speed, deception, and geographic understanding so complete that the enemy was defeated before the first major engagement. Napoleon had destroyed an army with a map, but Ulm was a prelude. The Austrian surrender eliminated one army, not the war. A second Austrian force, combined with a massive Russian army under the command of General Kutuzov, was retreating eastward, drawing Napoleon deeper into Central Europe, further from his bases, closer to the vast reserves of manpower that Russia could deploy. The coalition's strategy, whether by design or by the accident of retreat, was to trade space for time, to pull Napoleon forward until winter, exhaustion, and the convergence of Allied forces made him vulnerable. Napoleon understood this. He pursued anyway. He took Vienna on November 13th, entering the Habsburg capital without a fight, the second time in 8 years that a French army had threatened the city. And this time, there was no negotiation, no treaty signed in the field. The Austrian court fled eastward. The Russian and Austrian armies consolidated near the Moravian town of Austerlitz, roughly 70 miles north of Vienna. Tsar Alexander I arrived to take nominal command, accompanied by a retinue of courtiers and advisors who had collectively considerably more confidence than military experience. The Allied force numbered roughly 85,000 men. Napoleon had approximately 73,000, with reinforcements under Davout still marching hard to reach him. He was outnumbered, far from home, and operating at the end of a supply line that stretched back across half of Europe. By every conventional measure of strategic prudence, he should have paused, consolidated, and waited for better odds. He did not wait. He had read the situation, read the terrain, read the enemy, read the personalities of the commanders facing him, and he saw something that the Allies did not see about themselves. He saw that they would attack. The ground Napoleon chose was a landscape of gentle hills and frozen ponds south of Austerlitz, anchored by a feature called the Pratzen Heights, a long elevated ridge that dominated the surrounding terrain. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, pulling troops away from the villages south of the heights, making that sector look vulnerable. He wanted the Allies to see the weakness. He wanted them to mass their forces against it, to swing south in an enveloping movement that would pin the French right while the Allied center crossed the Pratzen Heights and descended into the valley beyond. Because once they descended, once the Allied center left the heights would be empty, and Napoleon would take them. The plan required the enemy to do exactly what Napoleon predicted they would do. It required them to be aggressive when caution would have served them better. It required the Tsar's advisors, who were urging attack over Kutuzov's reluctance, to prevail. It required the fog that blanketed the field on the morning of December 2nd to lift at the right moment, revealing the Allied movement and confirming that the trap was set. All of it happened. December 2nd, 1805. The anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, a coincidence he would have noted with satisfaction. The fog lay thick across the valleys at dawn, muffling sound, concealing movement. Below the Pratzen Heights, the Allied columns began their ponderous southward wheel. Exactly as Napoleon had anticipated, tens of thousands of Russian and Austrian soldiers marching away from the center, toward the French right, where Davout's corps, arriving after a forced march of extraordinary speed, was just barely holding the line. Napoleon watched from a command post on the Santon, a small hill north of the field. He waited. He let the Allied movement develop. He let the center empty. Then, at approximately 9 in the morning, as the December sun broke through the fog, the famous Sun of Austerlitz that would become one of the enduring images of Napoleonic legend, he gave the order. Soult's corps advanced up the Pratzen Heights. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Allied army was cut in two. The forces that had marched south found themselves isolated, attacked from the flank, pressed against frozen ponds that cracked and broke under the weight of retreating men and horses. The forces north of the heights were driven back in disorder. The center, the heights themselves, was now French. And from that commanding position, Napoleon's artillery could fire in every direction into masses of men who had lost their cohesion, their command structure, and their will. The battle lasted roughly 9 hours. By late afternoon, the Allied army had ceased to exist as an organized force. The Russians and Austrians lost approximately 15,000 killed and wounded, and another 12,000 captured, along with nearly 200 guns. French losses were roughly 9,000. Tsar Alexander, who had insisted on battle over the objections of his most experienced general, fled the field in tears. The Austrian Emperor Francis requested an immediate armistice. Austerlitz was not just a victory, it was a masterpiece. A battle so perfectly conceived, so precisely executed, and so devastatingly complete that it entered the military canon as a kind of Platonic ideal. The battle of annihilation, the decisive engagement that ends a war in a single afternoon. Military academies still teach it. Strategists still study it. It remains more than 2 centuries later the standard against which all subsequent battles of maneuver are measured. It was also the high water mark of Napoleon's military genius, though no one, least of all Napoleon, could have known that at the time. The peace that followed Austerlitz remade Europe. Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg in December 1805, ceding territory, paying indemnities, and accepting a diminished role in German affairs that effectively ended the thousand-year fiction of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon dissolved that ancient institution formally in 1806, replacing it with the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states reorganized, consolidated, and aligned with France under Napoleon's direct supervision. Prussia, which had wavered on the edge of the coalition without committing, watched the dissolution with mounting alarm. Russia retreated eastward, wounded but not broken. Tsar Alexander nursed his humiliation and began planning for the next round, and Britain remained untouched, unreachable, its navy supreme, its subsidies flowing to any continental power willing to take up arms against France. 3 weeks before Austerlitz, on October 21, 1805, Admiral Nelson had destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, a victory that cost Nelson his life and cost Napoleon any realistic hope of challenging British naval dominance. The strategic implications were fundamental. Napoleon could win every battle on land and still not win the war, because the war's ultimate guarantor, Britain, existed behind a moat of salt water that his armies could not cross. This asymmetry would define the next decade. Napoleon would win campaign after campaign, defeat army after army, impose treaty after treaty, and the wars would not end because the one enemy that mattered most could not be reached by the means at his disposal. He tried other means. The Continental System, announced by the Berlin Decree of November 1806, was Napoleon's attempt to defeat Britain economically rather than militarily. The logic was straightforward. If British goods could be excluded from every port in Europe, British commerce would collapse, British credit would fail, and Britain would be forced to make peace. To achieve this, Napoleon needed every European coastline to enforce the blockade, every harbor, every customs house, every fishing village that might unload a crate of British textiles or colonial sugar. The ambition was breathtaking. It was also, in the long run, impossible. And the effort to make it possible would drag Napoleon into the 2 campaigns that destroyed him. But that was in the future. In 1806, riding the momentum of Austerlitz, the future looked like a straight line extending infinitely upward. Prussia learned the cost of opposing Napoleon in the autumn of 1806, and the lesson took approximately 2 weeks. The Prussian army that marched against France in October of that year was an institution trading on a reputation earned under Frederick the Great, 40 years dead. The officers were aged. The tactics were rigid. The command structure was paralyzed by the diffusion of authority among multiple headquarters that could not agree on a plan. The army was, in a sense, a museum exhibit, beautifully maintained, historically significant, and utterly unprepared for what it was about to encounter. Napoleon struck with the speed that had become his defining characteristic. On October 14th, 1806, 2 battles were fought simultaneously. At Jena, where Napoleon himself commanded, and at Auerstedt, 14 miles to the north, where Marshal Davout, with a single corps of 27,000 men, engaged and defeated the main Prussian army of 50,000 under the Duke of Brunswick. The Duke was mortally wounded. The Prussian army disintegrated. Within weeks, Napoleon was in Berlin, sitting in Frederick the Great's palace at Potsdam, visiting his tomb, and reportedly taking the dead king's sword as a trophy. The conquest of Prussia, a great power, one of the 5 pillars of the European state system, in the space of a month was a demonstration of military supremacy so complete that it altered the political psychology of the continent. If Prussia could fall this fast, who was safe? The answer, increasingly, was no one, not unless they were an island. The Prussian collapse drove the war eastward into Poland and toward Russia. The winter campaign of 1806 to 1807 was the hardest fighting Napoleon had yet faced. The Russians under General Bennigsen were not the Austrians or the Prussians. They were stubborn, resilient, willing to absorb punishment, and continue fighting in conditions that would have broken other armies. The Battle of Eylau, fought in a snowstorm in February 1807, was a slaughterhouse. roughly 15,000 French casualties, perhaps an equal number of Russian, that ended in something neither side could honestly call a victory. Napoleon held the field, but the field was covered with the dead, and the snow was red, and the Russian army had withdrawn in good order, unbroken. Eylau was a warning. It was the first battle in which Napoleon's formula, speed, concentration, the devastating strike at the decisive point, had failed to produce a decisive result. The Russian army was different. It was vast. It was patient. It could lose a battle and retreat into a hinterland so deep that pursuit became its own form of defeat. These were qualities that Napoleon would have done well to study more carefully. He did not. He recovered. At Friedland in June 1807, he caught Bennigsen's army with a river at its back and administered the kind of crushing defeat that had become his specialty. 14,000 Russian casualties, a shattered army, a czar who had no choice but to negotiate. The meeting at Tilsit in July 1807 was one of the most theatrical diplomatic encounters in European history. Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft moored in the middle of the Niemen River, equidistant from both banks, surrounded by decorated boats and waving flags while their respective armies watched from the shores. The symbolism was deliberate. Two emperors, two empires meeting as equals in the middle of a river with the world arranged around them. What they agreed to on that raft reshaped the continent. Prussia was dismembered, stripped of half its territory, reduced to a rump state occupied by French troops and forced to pay ruinous indemnities. A new entity, the Duchy of Warsaw, was carved from Prussian Poland, serving as a French client state and a permanent threat to both Prussia and Russia. Russia, in exchange for accepting France's dominance of Western and Central Europe, was given a free hand in its own sphere. Finland, which it would take from Sweden, and the Ottoman borderlands, where it had long-standing ambitions. The personal chemistry between Napoleon and Alexander at Tilsit was, by all accounts, genuine, or at least performed with sufficient conviction that both men and their courts believed it was genuine. Alexander was young, impressionable, and susceptible to Napoleon's charisma. Napoleon was at the zenith of his power and could afford to be generous. They talked for hours. They reviewed troops together. They planned, or seemed to plan, a shared future in which France and Russia would divide the world between them, leaving Britain isolated and friendless. It was perhaps the closest Napoleon ever came to achieving a stable European settlement. It was also, as events would prove, built on a foundation of mutual misunderstanding and incompatible interests that would take only a few years to collapse. By 1808, Napoleon's empire had reached a territorial extent that no European power had matched since Rome. France itself had been expanded to include Belgium, the Rhineland, parts of northwestern Italy, and the Dalmatian coast. Around this enlarged France orbited a constellation of satellite states and allied kingdoms that stretched from the Atlantic to the Vistula: the Kingdom of Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Westphalia, the Duchy of Warsaw, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Holland, the Kingdom of Spain. Most of these were ruled by Napoleon's relatives, brothers, sisters, brothers-in-law, installed on borrowed thrones like chess pieces arranged by a single hand. Joseph was king of Naples, then king of Spain. Louis was king of Holland. Jerome was king of Westphalia. Each was expected to govern in France's interest, enforce the continental system, and submit to Napoleon's authority in all matters of consequence. The system looked formidable on a map. Maps, however, do not show resistance. The first crack appeared in Spain, and it would never fully close. The Spanish intervention of 1808 began as a dynastic manipulation and became a catastrophe. The Spanish royal family, the Bourbons, a branch of the same dynasty that the French Revolution had decapitated, was weak, divided, and corrupt. King Charles IV was dominated by his wife's favorite, Manuel Godoy, and his son Ferdinand was plotting to replace him. Napoleon, seeing an opportunity to extend French control over the Iberian Peninsula and close its ports to British trade, exploited the family quarrel. He summoned both Charles and Ferdinand to Bayonne in southern France and through a combination of pressure and deception induced both to abdicate. He then placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people responded with a fury that Napoleon had not anticipated and never fully understood. The uprising that began on May 2, 1808, the Dos de Mayo, immortalized in Goya's painting, one was not a military campaign. It was a popular insurrection, spontaneous, decentralized, and driven by a combination of national pride, religious fervor, and sheer outrage at the imposition of a foreign king. The Spanish regular army was quickly defeated, but the guerrilla resistance that replaced it was something entirely new in Napoleon's experience. A war without fronts, without decisive battles, without an enemy that could be cornered and destroyed. The guerrilleros struck at supply convoys, assassinated sentries, tortured captured soldiers, and melted back into the mountains and the villages, supported by a civilian population that regarded the French not as liberators, but as invaders. Napoleon poured troops into Spain. He went himself in late 1808 and won every battle he fought. He was still Napoleon, and no Spanish army could stand against him in the open field. But winning battles in Spain was like winning arguments with the sea. The resistance did not depend on battles. It depended on will and terrain, and the willingness of ordinary people to die rather than submit. He stayed only a few months. Other crises, Austria was rearming, the wider empire required his attention, pulled him away. He left the Spanish War to his marshals, who fought it with increasing brutality and decreasing effectiveness for the next 6 years. The war consumed roughly 300,000 French soldiers. It tied down armies that were desperately needed elsewhere. It provided Britain with a continental foothold from which Wellington could operate, slowly, methodically, grinding northward through Portugal and Spain in a campaign that would eventually cross the Pyrenees and enter France itself. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer. The metaphor was precise. It was a wound that would not heal, that drained strength continuously, that infected everything it touched. The voices of the Spanish people who resisted, the villagers who fed the guerrilleros, the priests who blessed their weapons, the women who carried messages, the men who died anonymously in ambushes along mountain roads, are largely absent from the Napoleonic sources. The French recorded their own losses. The Spanish recorded their own heroism. But the texture of daily life under occupation, the specific experiences of those who endured it, the calculus by which a farmer or a shopkeeper decided to risk death by sheltering a partisan, these things exist only in fragments. Goya saw them. His disasters of war etchings produced between 1810 and 1820 remain the most searing visual record of what the war looked like from the ground. Bodies mutilated, civilians executed, women violated, and above every scene an implicit question, is this what liberation looks like? The Spanish resistance was, in military terms, a minor theater. In strategic terms, it was a turning point. It demonstrated that Napoleon's power had limits, that an occupied people, sufficiently motivated, could resist indefinitely, and that the cost of holding unwilling territory could exceed the value of possessing it. It was a lesson that empires have learned and forgotten and learned again across centuries, and it was a lesson that Napoleon, whose genius was for the concentration of force rather than the management of occupation, was constitutionally unable to absorb. While Spain bled, the rest of the empire continued to expand, and the internal contradictions of that expansion continued to deepen. The continental system, Napoleon's economic weapon against Britain, was strangling not just the enemy but the allies. The exclusion of British goods from European markets caused shortages, inflation, and popular resentment across the continent. The economies of the satellite states suffered. Smuggling became endemic. Entire coastal communities organized themselves around the clandestine import of British manufactures, and the enforcement measures required to suppress the trade created friction between Napoleon and his nominal allies at every level. Russia was the most important case. The Tilsit Agreement had committed Alexander to enforcing the continental system, but Russian landowners depended on the export of grain, timber, and raw materials to Britain, and the closing of British markets devastated them. Russian merchants depended on the import of British manufactured goods, and their absence created shortages that no French substitute could fill. Alexander faced mounting domestic pressure to abandon the system, and by 1810 he had effectively done so, quietly reopening Russian ports to neutral shipping that everyone understood was carrying British cargo under different flags. Napoleon watched this erosion with growing anger. The continental system was his strategy, his alternative to the naval power he could not match, and its enforcement was, in his mind, a test of loyalty. Every port that opened to British trade was a breach in the wall he was building around his enemy. Every ally that defected from the system was an ally that had chosen Britain over France. The logic led him, with a certain terrible inevitability, toward the decision that would destroy everything he had built. But before that decision, before the march east that would become the defining catastrophe of his reign, there were other matters to settle. His marriage to Josephine, which had survived infidelity, political upheaval, and the transformation of a revolutionary general into an emperor, could not survive the one failure that mattered most in dynastic politics. She could not give him an heir. The divorce, finalized in December 1809, was conducted with a formality that barely concealed its cruelty. Josephine wept. Napoleon, according to witnesses, wept as well, though whether from genuine emotion or from the sentimentality that he deployed as skillfully as grapeshot is impossible to determine at this distance. She was given an income, a residence, and the title of Empress. She was also given to understand that her role in his story was finished. 3 months later, Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria, the 18-year-old daughter of Emperor Francis. The same Francis whose armies Napoleon had defeated at Austerlitz, whose capital Napoleon had occupied, whose empire Napoleon had diminished by treaty after treaty. The marriage was a dynastic alliance of the most traditional kind. A Habsburg princess given to a Corsican upstart in exchange for political stability. Her body offered as a guarantee of peace between two powers that had spent 15 years trying to destroy each other. Marie-Louise bore Napoleon a son in March 1811. The boy was titled the King of Rome. Napoleon, holding his heir, must have felt that the edifice was complete. The dynasty established, the succession secured, the empire rooted not just in his personal genius, but in the biological continuity that legitimate monarchy required. He was 41 years old. He ruled, directly or indirectly, more of Europe than any single individual since Charlemagne. His armies numbered more than 1 million men under arms. His legal code governed the lives of tens of millions. His name was on the maps, the coins, the documents, the monuments of half a continent. And yet the structure was hollow in ways that only became visible under pressure. The satellite kingdoms resented French control. The continental system was failing. Spain was consuming men and money at a rate that no treasury could sustain. Britain remained undefeated, its navy unchallenged, its subsidies flowing to every enemy Napoleon had ever made and every enemy he had yet to make. And Russia, vast, cold, patient Russia, had drifted from alliance to neutrality to something that looked, from Paris, increasingly like hostility. The gap between the map and the reality was widening. Napoleon, who could read a battlefield with preternatural clarity, could not read this gap. Or perhaps he read it and concluded that the solution was the same one that had always worked. More force, more speed, more concentration at the decisive point. He began to plan the invasion of Russia. He could not have known, or perhaps he could have known and chose not to, that he was planning the destruction of his own empire. The army he assembled in the spring of 1812 was the largest military force Europe had ever seen. The numbers alone stagger. Approximately 615,000 men crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory in late June, with another 100,000 in reserve behind them. They came from every corner of the empire and its satellites, French of course, but also Poles, Italians, Germans from half a dozen states, Dutch, Swiss, Croatians, Spaniards, Portuguese, even a contingent of Prussians and Austrians compelled by treaty to march alongside the power that had humiliated them. It was a multinational host, held together not by shared conviction, but by the gravitational pull of a single man's will. And it stretched along the roads of Eastern Europe in columns so vast that the rear of the army was still crossing the Niemen days after the vanguard had disappeared into the Lithuanian forests. The logistical challenge was unprecedented. Napoleon understood supply. He had built his Italian campaigns on speed precisely because speed reduced the need for supply lines. But the scale of this army overwhelmed every system he had devised. The wagons could not keep up with the marching columns. The roads, such as they were, disintegrated under the weight of 600,000 men, their horses, their artillery, their baggage trains. Forage was scarce. The Russian countryside was poorer than Western Europe. The villages smaller. The distances between them greater. Horses began dying in the first week. Men began deserting in the second. And the Russians would not fight. This was the element that Napoleon had not accounted for, or had accounted for and dismissed. His entire operational method depended on bringing the enemy to battle quickly, destroying their army in a single decisive engagement and dictating terms. The Russians, whether by strategic design or by the necessity imposed by their own unreadiness, refused to cooperate. The two main Russian armies in Memoir, under Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, retreated steadily eastward, burning crops, destroying bridges, emptying villages, drawing the French deeper into a landscape that offered nothing to sustain them and everything to consume them. Napoleon pursued. He could not do otherwise. His method demanded the decisive battle, and without it, he had no mechanism for ending the campaign. He marched east through Vilna, through Vitebsk, through Smolensk, each time expecting the Russians to stand and fight, each time arriving to find burning buildings and empty fields. The army that had crossed the Niemen at 600,000 was shrinking with every mile, not primarily through combat, but through disease, exhaustion, hunger, and the simple dissolution that afflicts any military force operating beyond the limits of its supply system. Typhus ravaged the columns. Dysentery hollowed men out from within. Horses died by the tens of thousands, and without horses the artillery could not move, the cavalry could not scout, and the supply wagons sat immobile on roads that were already more mud than surface. By the time the French reached Smolensk in mid-August, Napoleon had lost roughly a third of his force without fighting a major battle. The city, when he took it, was burning. The Russians had set it alight rather than surrender it intact. He stood in the ruins and faced a decision that would determine everything that followed. He could stop. He could consolidate at Smolensk, establish a defensible position, wait for his supply lines to catch up, and resume the campaign in the spring. This was the counsel of several of his marshals, and it was, by any rational assessment, the correct decision. The army needed rest, food, and reinforcement. The Russian winter was approaching. The strategic situation would not deteriorate significantly with a pause. He did not stop. The reasons were characteristic. Stopping meant accepting that the campaign could not be decided in a single season. It meant acknowledging that the enemy had a strategy, that the strategy was working, and that his own method, the rapid, decisive strike, had been neutralized. It meant patience, and patience was not among Napoleon's gifts. He was a sprinter in a distance race, and rather than adjust his pace, he chose to sprint harder. He marched on Moscow. The Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, roughly 70 miles west of Moscow, was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russians, now under the command of the aging but tenacious Mikhail Kutuzov, the same general who had counseled caution at Austerlitz and been overruled by the Tsar, finally turned to fight. The battle was a brutal, frontal engagement that bore almost no resemblance to Napoleon's masterpieces of maneuver. There was no flanking movement, no exploitation of terrain, no hidden corps arriving at the decisive moment. There was instead a direct assault on prepared Russian positions, earthworks, and redoubts that the Russians had been building for days, conducted across open ground under devastating artillery fire with a courage and a wastefulness that would have been more at home in the First World War than in the age of Austerlitz. Napoleon's conduct at Borodino has been debated by historians for 2 centuries. He was ill, a urinary complaint that left him in pain and some have argued impaired his judgment. He commanded from a position far behind the front, unable to see clearly, reluctant to commit the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve, to the battle even at moments when their intervention might have turned a costly victory into a decisive one. His marshals pleaded with him. Nay, the bravest and most reckless of them reportedly raged at the refusal. Napoleon held the guard back. Why? The answer, if there is one, reveals something about the subtle erosion that had begun to affect Napoleon's decision-making. At Austerlitz, he had gambled everything because he trusted his reading of the enemy and his ability to control events. At Borodino, he hesitated because he could no longer see the decisive point. The battlefield was obscured by smoke, the situation was confused, the enemy was behaving in ways he had not predicted, standing and fighting with a ferocity that absorbed punishment without breaking. For perhaps the first time in a major engagement, Napoleon was not the fastest mind on the field. He was a man reacting to events rather than shaping them. The Russians lost approximately 45,000 men. The French lost roughly 30,000, possibly more. Kutuzov withdrew in good order, his army battered but intact. Napoleon held the field, and the road to Moscow was open. He entered Moscow on September 14th. The city was largely empty. The population had fled. The governor, Rostopchin, had, depending on which source you trust, either ordered the city burned or permitted the fires that broke out almost immediately after the French arrived. Within days, much of Moscow was in flames. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as the city he had marched 2,000 miles to capture consumed itself around him. He waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. He sent letters. He sent emissaries. He proposed terms that were, by the standards of his previous treaties, relatively moderate. Alexander did not respond. The silence was more devastating than any battle. It meant that the entire strategic premise of the campaign, that the capture of Moscow would compel Russia to negotiate, was wrong. Moscow was not Russia's capital in the way that Vienna was Austria's or Berlin was Prussia's. It was a spiritual center, an ancient city, a symbol, but the government operated from St. Petersburg, and the Tsar's authority did not depend on holding any particular piece of ground. Russia was too vast, too deep, too diffuse to be conquered by taking a single city, and the refusal to negotiate was itself a form of warfare, a weapon of time and space wielded against an enemy who had neither. On October 19th, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was the destruction of the Grande Armée, and it was accomplished less by Russian arms than by Russian geography, Russian weather, and the cumulative consequences of every logistical failure that had been building since June. The retreat from Moscow has become one of the iconic catastrophes of military history, and the iconic status is earned. The army that left Moscow numbered roughly 100,000 men, a fraction of the force that had crossed the Niemen 4 months earlier. They marched west through a landscape they had already stripped bare on the advance, following roads they had already destroyed, passing through villages they had already burned. There was no food. There was no forage. The horses were dying, which meant the cavalry was dying, which meant the army was blind, unable to scout, unable to screen its flanks, unable to detect the Russian forces that shadowed its march and struck at its stragglers with increasing boldness. And then the cold came. The Russian winter of 1812 arrived early and with a severity that exceeded even the normal brutality of the continental climate. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero, then 30 below. Men froze to death on the march. They froze in their sleep. They froze standing up, leaning against trees, still clutching their muskets. The wounded, left behind when the wagons could no longer carry them, froze where they lay. Horses collapsed and were butchered for meat before they were fully dead. The army shed men like a wounded animal shedding blood, a continuous, unstoppable hemorrhage of human life that turned the road from Moscow into a corridor of corpses. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November was the final agony. The bridges had been destroyed. The river was partially frozen, enough to be impassable by ford, not enough to bear the weight of an army. Napoleon's engineers, working in water that killed them, built 2 pontoon bridges under Russian fire. The army crossed in a chaotic, desperate scramble that lasted 2 days. Thousands drowned. Thousands more were killed by Russian artillery or crushed in the stampede on the bridges. Those who made it across were barely an army anymore in the interim. They were a mass of frozen, starving, dying men held together by nothing more than the instinct to keep moving west. Napoleon left the army in early December, racing ahead to Paris in a sleigh. He had received news that a general named Mallet had attempted a coup in Paris, briefly convincing parts of the garrison that Napoleon was dead. The coup had failed, but its very possibility revealed how fragile the empire's political structure was, how dependent it was on the physical presence and perceived invincibility of one man. Napoleon needed to be in Paris. He needed to raise a new army. He needed, above all, to control the narrative of what had happened in Russia before the narrative controlled him. The army he left behind, what remained of it, staggered across the Niemen in December and January. Of the 615,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned in any condition to fight. Some estimates put the number of effective soldiers at fewer than 50,000. The rest were dead, captured, deserted, or so broken by cold and hunger and disease that they would never serve again. The human cost is almost impossible to comprehend at the level of individual experience. The sources that survive, memoirs of officers, journals of surgeons, letters written by men who made it home, describe scenes that challenge the capacity of language. Men eating candle wax, men eating leather, men killing each other for a handful of grain, men walking until their feet were black with frostbite and then walking further because stopping meant death. The surgeon Dominique Jean Larrey, Napoleon's chief medical officer, performed amputations by the hundreds, arms, legs, feet, fingers, in conditions that would have been primitive for a medieval barber surgeon, without anesthesia, without antisepsis, without adequate instruments, the screams of his patients audible above the wind. And what of the Russians? The peasants whose villages were burned, whose grain was stolen, whose livestock was slaughtered by both armies as they advanced and retreated across the same devastated landscape. The serfs who were conscripted into Kutuzov's army and died in numbers that Russia itself never fully counted. The women who survived the passage of 600,000 foreign soldiers through their land and were left to rebuild from ashes in a silence that the historical record has largely preserved. Their voices are the ones we do not have. The Napoleonic Wars are documented overwhelmingly from the perspective of the officer class in French, Russian, British, Austrian. Men who could read, who could write, who had the social position that made their experiences seem worth recording. The Russian peasant who watched Napoleon's army march past his burning village, who buried his dead and replanted his fields and never wrote a word about any of it, is as central to this story as any marshal or emperor, and as absent from the archive. We know the numbers. We do not know the names. Napoleon arrived in Paris on December 18th, 1812, and immediately set about doing what he did better than anyone alive, rebuilding from catastrophe. The speed of the reconstruction was, even by his standards, remarkable. Within months, he had conscripted a new army, younger, less experienced, less well-equipped than the Grande Armée that had perished in Russia, but numerically formidable. He reached back into the age cohorts that had already been drafted, called up the class of 1813 ahead of schedule, and pulled troops from Spain from garrison duty, from everywhere he could find men who could hold a musket. The new army that assembled in the spring of 1813 numbered roughly 350,000 men. Many were teenagers. The French called them Marie-Louises after the Empress because they were so young they seemed to belong to her generation rather than to their fathers. They were brave. They were patriotic. They were in many cases shockingly unprepared for what awaited them. The coalition that now formed against Napoleon was the most formidable he had ever faced. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Britain, joined eventually by virtually every state in Europe, assembled armies that collectively outnumbered Napoleon's forces by a margin that no amount of tactical brilliance could reliably overcome. The Sixth Coalition was not just larger than its predecessors, it was smarter. The Allied commanders had spent 15 years studying Napoleon's methods, and they had learned. The Trachenberg Plan, adopted in the summer of 1813, codified their hard-won wisdom into a simple principle. Avoid battle with Napoleon personally, engage and defeat his subordinates, retreat when he advanced, advance when he withdrew. It was a strategy of patient exhaustion, and it worked. The German campaign of 1813, the campaign that would culminate in the Battle of Leipzig, the largest battle in European history before the 20th century, was Napoleon's last sustained display of operational brilliance, and it was not enough. He won at Lutzen in May. He won at Bautzen in May. He won these battles with the raw material of his new army. Boys who charged with bayonets because they had not been trained to maneuver, who advanced into artillery fire with a courage born of ignorance and devotion. But the victories were incomplete. The Allied armies retreated but did not break. Napoleon's cavalry, decimated in Russia and not yet rebuilt, could not pursue. The victories produced no strategic result. An armistice in the summer gave both sides time to reinforce, and the arithmetic of reinforcement favored the Allies overwhelmingly. When the fighting resumed in August, Austria had joined the coalition, adding another 200,000 men to the forces arrayed against France. Napoleon now faced armies converging from the north, the east, and the south, each large enough to threaten him, each under orders to avoid him if he turned to face them. He performed prodigies. At Dresden in August, he won his last great tactical victory in catching the Allied army of Bohemia as it advanced on the Saxon capital and driving it back with heavy losses. But Dresden was the exception. Around him, his marshals were losing. At Grossbeeren, at the Katzbach, at Dennewitz, defeated by Allied forces that were applying the Trachenberg Plan with disciplined consistency. Every time Napoleon won a battle, two of his subordinates lost one. The net result was a slow, inexorable contraction of his position. The noose tightened through September and into October. Napoleon concentrated his forces around Leipzig, the great Saxon trading city, aware that the Allies were converging and that a decisive battle was approaching. He had roughly 190,000 men. The Allies, drawing from every direction, would eventually assemble more than 350,000. The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations as it came to be called, was fought over 4 days from October 16th to 19th, 1813. It was not a single battle but a series of interlocking engagements around the perimeter of the city, fought in rain and mud and the smoke of 5,000 cannons, involving more men than had ever been assembled on a single field of battle in European history. Napoleon fought well. On the first day, he came close to breaking the Allied lines south of the city, and had Marmont's corps arrived in time, had one of those small contingencies that Napoleon's earlier career had always resolved in his favor broken differently, the battle might have ended with a French victory that prolonged the empire by years. It did not break differently. Marmont was late. The opportunity passed. Over the following days, Allied reinforcements arrived continuously, and the numerical disparity grew beyond anything that tactical skill could compensate. On October 18th, Saxon and Württemberg units fighting in Napoleon's army defected to the Allies in the middle of the battle, a betrayal that was also a recognition of which way the wind was blowing. On October 19th, Napoleon ordered the retreat. The withdrawal turned into disaster when the single bridge over the White Elster River was prematurely blown by an engineer who panicked at the approach of Allied troops. Thousands of French soldiers were trapped on the wrong side of the river. Some drowned trying to swim across. Some were captured. Marshal Poniatowski, the Polish hero who had been made a marshal only 2 days earlier, drowned in the river during the retreat. A death that carried, for the Poles who had staked their national hopes on Napoleon, a symbolic weight that extended far beyond the loss of a single officer. The French lost approximately 70,000 men at Leipzig, killed, wounded, captured, or deserted. The Allies lost roughly 54,000. The numbers were ruinous for both sides, but the Allies could absorb their losses. Napoleon could not. Leipzig broke the empire. In the weeks that followed, the Confederation of the Rhine dissolved. The German states that had been Napoleon's allies switched sides one by one. Holland revolted. The satellite kingdoms crumbled. The map that Napoleon had spent a decade drawing was being erased with a speed that matched its creation. He retreated across the Rhine, back into France, with an army that was a shadow of the force he had led into Germany 6 months earlier. Behind him, the coalition that had defeated him at Leipzig was already planning its next move, the invasion of France itself. For the first time since the Revolutionary Wars, foreign armies would cross the French frontier. For the first time since the Revolution, France would fight not for empire, but for survival. Napoleon was 44 years old. His empire was collapsing around him. His allies had deserted. His armies were depleted. His marshals were exhausted. And some of them, quietly, carefully, in conversations that they did not commit to paper, had begun to wonder whether France's survival and Napoleon's survival were still the same thing. They were not. But it would take one more campaign to make that truth undeniable. The campaign of France in the early months of 1814 was, by a certain measure, Napoleon's finest military performance. This is a claim that requires qualification. The Italian campaign of 1796 was more consequential. Austerlitz was more devastating. The Ulm maneuver was more elegant. But the campaign of 1814 was fought under constraints so severe that what Napoleon achieved with the means available to him borders on the incomprehensible. He had approximately 70,000 men, many of them conscripts with weeks of training. Facing him were 3 Allied armies totaling more than 300,000. Blücher's army of Silesia advancing from the east, Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia advancing from the south, and additional forces operating on the flanks. The Allies intended to converge on Paris, and the weight of numbers suggested that nothing could stop them. Napoleon stopped them, repeatedly, for 2 months. He fought with a speed and an inventiveness that recalled the young general of 1796, the man who had dazzled Italy with his ability to move faster than the enemy could think. He struck Blücher at Brienne, at La Rodière, at Champaubert, at Montmirail, at Château-Thierry, at Vauchamp, a sequence of blows delivered over the course of a single week in February that inflicted 30,000 casualties on the Prussian army and drove it into temporary retreat. Then he turned south, struck Schwarzenberg, pushed him back, and turned north again to deal with Blücher's recovery. The campaign was a masterpiece of interior lines. The classic strategy of a force positioned between 2 enemies, striking one, then the other, exploiting the gap between them to defeat both in detail. It was the same geometry as the Italian campaign, and for a few weeks it seemed possible, just barely, tantalizingly possible, that it might produce the same result. It could not. The mathematics were too unfavorable. Every time Napoleon won a battle, the Allies regrouped, absorbed their losses, and advanced again. Every time he destroyed a corps, 2 more appeared. His own losses, though smaller in each individual engagement, could not be replaced. The boys he was leading into battle were fighting with a desperation that impressed even the enemy. But desperation was not a substitute for numbers, and the numbers were merciless. The Allies, to their credit, held their nerve. There were moments, after Montmirail, after Montereau, when the coalition might have fractured, when Austria might have sought a separate peace, when the sheer psychological pressure of facing Napoleon in the field might have induced the caution that had undone previous coalitions. Tsar Alexander, to his credit or his stubbornness, refused to waver. He insisted on the march to Paris. He insisted on Napoleon's removal. The end came quickly. On March 30th, 1814, while Napoleon was maneuvering east of Paris in a last attempt to cut the Allied supply lines and force a withdrawal, the Allies attacked the French capital. The defense was brave and hopeless. Marmont and Mortier held the heights of Montmartre with a scratch force of regulars and National Guard, and by nightfall, Paris had surrendered. Napoleon learned of the fall of Paris on March 31st. He rushed toward the city, but it was too late. His marshals, Ney, Berthier, Lefebvre, MacDonald, Oudinot, confronted him at Fontainebleau. They told him what he did not want to hear. It was over. The scene at Fontainebleau has been told many times and mythologized beyond reliable reconstruction, but the core is attested by multiple sources. Napoleon proposed to march on Paris. His marshals refused. He proposed to continue the fight in the south. They refused. He raged. He threatened. He cajoled. Ney, the bravest of the brave, the man who had charged at Eylau and led the rear guard from Moscow, reportedly told him, "The army will obey its generals." The sentence contained everything. The army, his army, the instrument he had built and wielded and sacrificed and rebuilt, would no longer follow him. The marshals had made their choice. They had chosen France over Napoleon, or perhaps they had chosen themselves over both, and the distinction in that room at that moment no longer mattered. On April 6th, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The terms, negotiated by Caulaincourt with the Allied powers, were more generous than he had reason to expect. He was given sovereignty over the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean territory off the coast of Tuscany. He was permitted to retain the title of emperor. He was granted an annual income of 2 million francs to be paid by the French government. His wife and son were to join him. The income would never be paid. His wife would never come. On April 20th, in the courtyard of the palace at Fontainebleau, Napoleon said goodbye to the old guard, the grizzled veterans who had followed him from Italy to Egypt to Austerlitz to Moscow and back. He embraced General Petit. He kissed the regiment's eagle, the gilded standard that the guard had carried across a continent. He spoke briefly, his voice cracking. Then he got into a carriage and rode south toward Exile. He was 44 years old. He had ruled France for 15 years, commanded the largest armies Europe had ever seen, defeated every great power on the continent at least once, reshaped the legal and administrative foundations of a dozen nations, and produced a body count that historians would spend the next 2 centuries trying to calculate. The estimates vary. The Napoleonic Wars, taken in their entirety, from the first campaigns of the Revolutionary period through Waterloo, killed somewhere between 3.5 million and 6 million people. The range is wide because the sources are incomplete, because the counting methods differ, because many of the dead were civilians whose deaths were never systematically recorded. The Russian campaign alone may have killed 500,000 men on the French side and a comparable number on the Russian side, plus an uncounted number of civilians who died of famine, disease, and exposure in the campaign's aftermath. These numbers do not speak. They do not convey the experience of dying in a ditch outside Smolensk, or drowning in the Berezina, or bleeding out on the field at Leipzig while the surgeons worked through the night by lantern light. They do not convey the experience of the widows, the orphans, the mothers who received no notification because there was no system to provide one. They are abstractions, and like all abstractions, they conceal more than they reveal. But they are what we have, and they should be named. Napoleon, riding south through a France that was half hostile and half indifferent, passed through towns where he was recognized and sometimes threatened. At Orgon, in Provence, a crowd burned him in effigy while he hid in his carriage. He reportedly disguised himself in an Austrian uniform to avoid assassination. The man who had entered Milan in triumph, who had ridden through the gates of Vienna, who had stood in the Kremlin and watched Moscow burn, was now a fugitive in his own country, protected by a small escort of Allied cavalry heading for an island he had never seen. Elba was small. It was rocky. It was approximately 12 miles long and 7 miles wide. It had a population of roughly 12,000. It had iron mines, some vineyards, and a view of the Tuscan coast. For the man who had ruled 80 million people, it was a cage. He arrived on May 4th, 1814. He inspected the island. He reorganized its administration. He improved its roads. He reviewed the tiny garrison, 600 soldiers of the old guard who had volunteered to accompany him, plus a small contingent of local militia. He planted trees. He entertained visitors. He read. He watched the sea. And he waited. The Congress of Vienna, which convened in September of 1814 to reassemble the Europe that Napoleon had shattered, was the most ambitious diplomatic gathering the continent had seen in centuries. Every power that mattered was represented. Talleyrand, the infinitely adaptable survivor who had served the Ancien Regime, the Revolution, the Directory, the Consulate, and the Empire before switching his allegiance to the restored Bourbons with the seamlessness of a man changing coats, represented France. Metternich represented Austria, Castlereagh represented Britain, Tsar Alexander represented Russia, and also represented his own considerable vanity, which required management as delicate as any territorial negotiation. Hardenberg and Humboldt represented Prussia. They danced, they argued, they drew lines on maps, they redistributed populations like cargo, they attempted, with varying degrees of sincerity and success, to construct a European order that would prevent the recurrence of what they had just survived. 20 years of nearly continuous warfare that had killed millions, redrawn every border, and demonstrated that the revolutionary energies unleashed in 1789 could not be contained by the methods of the 18th century. The settlement they produced was in its broad outlines conservative. The Bourbon dynasty was restored in France, in the person of Louis XVIII, a gouty, cautious, moderately intelligent man who had the advantage of being the dead king's brother and the disadvantage of being associated in the minds of most French citizens with everything the Revolution had swept away. The old dynasties were restored across Europe wherever possible. The principle of legitimacy, the idea that sovereign authority derived from hereditary right rather than popular consent or military conquest, was reasserted as the foundation of international order. But the Congress could not simply restore the world of 1789. Too much had changed. The Holy Roman Empire was gone and would not return. The map of Germany had been simplified from more than 300 sovereign entities to roughly 39, and this consolidation, Napoleon's inadvertent gift to German nationalism, was preserved. Poland remained partitioned. Belgium was joined to the Netherlands. Switzerland was guaranteed its neutrality. Italy remained a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, most of them under Austrian influence, none of them independent in any meaningful sense. The Congress also produced something less visible but ultimately more consequential: a system. The Concert of Europe, as it came to be called, was an informal agreement among the great powers to consult regularly, to manage crises collectively, and to prevent any single state from achieving the kind of dominance that France had exercised under Napoleon. It was not a government, it was not a constitution, it was a set of habits and expectations reinforced by periodic congresses and maintained by the shared memory of what had happened when the system broke down. It would keep the peace, or something resembling peace, for nearly a century. That is no small achievement. It is also an achievement built on the suppression of the very forces, nationalism, liberalism, popular sovereignty, that Napoleon had, however inadvertently, unleashed across the continent. The Congress of Vienna was a dam. The waters behind it would rise for decades before they finally broke through. None of this mattered to Napoleon on Elba, or rather all of it mattered, but in a specific and personal way. He was watching. He had sources. Visitors who brought news, letters that slipped past the desultory surveillance the Allies maintained, reports from loyalists who had remained in France and kept him informed of developments. What they told him was this: the Bourbon Restoration was failing. Louis XVIII was not incompetent. He was, in fact, more intelligent and more politically realistic than most of the émigrés who had returned with him, and he understood that France could not simply pretend that the previous 25 years had not happened. He issued a constitutional charter. He preserved most of Napoleon's administrative reforms. He retained the civil code. He attempted a policy of reconciliation, balancing the demands of the returned royalists against the sensibilities of the vast majority of French citizens who had lived, worked, fought, and prospered under the revolution in the empire. But the returning émigrés were not interested in reconciliation. They wanted restoration. Full, uncompromising restoration of their lands, their privileges, their social position. They wanted the revolution undone. They wanted the men who had voted for the king's execution punished. They wanted the tricolor replaced with the white flag of the Bourbons. They wanted, in short, to behave as though they had won a war rather than been carried back to France in the baggage train of foreign armies. The army was the most dangerous pressure point. Napoleon's officers, men who had risen from nothing on the basis of ability, men who held their ranks and their honors and their pensions because the revolution in the empire had made such things possible, watched the returning aristocrats with a hostility that was not concealed. The Bourbons proposed to reduce the army. They proposed to replace Napoleonic officers with royalist ones. They proposed to restore the old system of purchase commissions. Every proposal was an insult, and every insult was registered. The soldiers had a saying. They said the Bourbons had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Napoleon, on Elba, heard all of this. He processed it the way he processed everything, rapidly, analytically, with an eye for the decisive point. France was unhappy. The army was disaffected. The Bourbons were making enemies faster than they were making friends. The Allies, absorbed in their negotiations at Vienna, were distracted and divided. The British commissioner assigned to watch Napoleon on Elba, Colonel Neil Campbell, was frequently absent, attending to personal business on the Italian mainland. The promised income of 2 million francs had not been paid. His wife, Marie-Louise, had not come. She had been intercepted by Austrian officials and installed in Parma, where she had taken a lover, Count Adam Albert von Neipperg, a one-eyed Austrian cavalry officer who would eventually become her second husband. Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, was being raised in Vienna as a Habsburg prince, his Napoleonic identity systematically erased. Everything that had been promised to him at Fontainebleau had been broken. Whether this justified what he did next is a question that admits no clean answer. What is not in question is that he had been making his calculations for months, and that by February of 1815 the calculation was complete. He would go back. On the evening of February 26, 1815, Napoleon and a force of roughly 1,000 men, the 600 guardsmen who had accompanied him to Elba, plus 400 volunteers, boarded 7 small vessels in the harbor of Portoferraio. The weather was fair. The sea was calm. Colonel Campbell was in Livorno. The flotilla sailed northwest through the night, threading between the French naval patrols that might have intercepted it if their commanders had been more vigilant or their orders more explicit. By all rights, the escape should have failed. The Mediterranean was not empty. The British and French navies between them had more than enough ships to blockade a small island. But vigilance had relaxed. Napoleon was, in the minds of most of the statesmen who had exiled him, a spent force, a deposed emperor playing at sovereignty on a rock, dangerous in theory but increasingly irrelevant in practice. They were wrong. Napoleon landed at Golfe Juan near Antibes on March 1, 1815. He had with him 1,000 men, no artillery, limited ammunition, and no realistic military capacity to fight his way to Paris against the forces that the Bourbon government could deploy. What he had was something that no amount of military calculation could quantify. He had his name. The march north from the coast, the route Napoleon as it would be called, Skoks, is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of political power, and it unfolded with a momentum that seemed to border on the supernatural. Napoleon chose a mountain route through the Alps, avoiding the Rhone Valley, where royalist sentiment was strong and the population might have been hostile. He marched through Grasse, through Digne, through Gap, through the mountain passes of the Dauphiné, his small column growing as soldiers, veterans, and civilians joined it at every town. The critical moment came near Grenoble, on March 7th. A battalion of the 5th Line Regiment sent by the Bourbon government to intercept and arrest him drew up across the road in a blocking position. Napoleon's 1,000 men faced the king's soldiers. Muskets were leveled. A single volley would have ended everything. Napoleon walked forward, alone. He opened his coat, baring his chest to the muskets, and spoke. "Soldiers of the 5th," he said, according to accounts that vary in their exact wording but agree on their essential content. "I am your emperor. If there is any man among you who would shoot his emperor, let him do it now." Silence. A pause that lasted, 5 seconds? 10? Long enough for history to hold its breath. Then the soldiers lowered their muskets, then they cheered, then they rushed forward to surround him, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" tearing the white Bourbon cockade from their caps and replacing it with the tricolor. The battalion had switched sides, not because of military force, not because of bribery, not because of any rational calculation of advantage. They had switched because the man standing in front of them in his gray overcoat and his bicorn hat was Napoleon. And they were his soldiers, and 20 years of shared glory and shared suffering had created a bond that the Bourbons, with their purchased commissions and their white flags and their tone-deaf arrogance, could not sever. The effect cascaded. Every regiment sent to stop Napoleon joined him instead. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, met his former emperor on the road, hesitated for less than a day, and defected, bringing his troops with him. Ney's defection was the end. If the bravest marshal in France would not fight for the Bourbons, no one would. Louis XVIII fled Paris on the night of March 19th, taking his court with him in a procession of carriages that headed north toward the Belgian border. He did not abdicate. He simply left with the particular dignity of a man who knows that the furniture is not his. Napoleon entered Paris on March 20th, 1815. He was carried up the steps of the Tuileries on the shoulders of a crowd. He had reconquered France in 20 days without firing a shot. The 100 days had begun. The achievement was so improbable that it demands explanation, and the explanation reveals something essential about the nature of Napoleon's power, something that goes beyond military genius, beyond administrative competence, beyond even charisma, though he possessed all three. Napoleon's return succeeded because he represented something that the Bourbon Restoration could not provide. The promise that talent mattered more than birth, that the gains of the revolution were irreversible, that a man could rise from nothing to everything if he was capable enough and bold enough and willing to work hard enough. This was the myth. The reality was considerably more complicated. Napoleon's France was an authoritarian state that suppressed dissent, conscripted its citizens by the hundreds of thousands, and served the interests of its ruler above all else. But myths are not lies. They are selective truths, amplified and distorted. And the selective truth at the heart of the Napoleonic myth, that the old world of inherited privilege was gone and would not return, was a truth that millions of French citizens and millions of Europeans beyond France believed and needed to continue believing. The soldiers who joined him on the road to Paris were not deluded. They knew what Napoleon was. Many of them bore the scars of his wars on their bodies. They had marched to Moscow and back. They had buried their friends. They had given their youth to his ambition. And they chose him anyway. They chose him over the Bourbons, chose him over peace, chose him over the quiet life that the Restoration might have offered, because the alternative was a return to a world in which they were nothing, in which their sacrifices meant nothing, in which the hierarchy of blood and title that the revolution had overturned would be reimposed by men who had spent the last 20 years in comfortable exile while they bled. This does not make the choice wise. It does not make the choice moral. It makes the choice comprehensible, and comprehension is what history owes to the people who lived it. Napoleon, for his part, understood the nature of his support and the fragility of his position with a clarity that his more romantic admirers tend to overlook. He knew that the enthusiasm of the army was not the same as the support of the nation. He knew that large portions of France, the West, the South, the propertied classes, the church, were hostile or at best indifferent. He knew that the Allied powers gathering at Vienna would not accept his return. He knew that war was coming, and that this time he would face the entire coalition simultaneously, without the years of preparation and the vast resources that had sustained his earlier campaigns. He tried briefly to present himself as a changed man, a liberal emperor, a constitutional monarch, a ruler who had learned from his mistakes and was prepared to govern with the consent of the governed. He promulgated the Acte Additionnel, a constitutional amendment drafted by the liberal theorist Benjamin Constant, which guaranteed civil liberties, established a bicameral legislature, and imposed constraints on imperial authority that would have been unthinkable during the empire's zenith. Whether Napoleon intended to honor these commitments is unknowable. What is knowable is that few believed he would, and that the Acte Additionnel impressed neither his supporters, who wanted the old Napoleon, nor his opponents, who wanted no Napoleon at all. The diplomatic situation was unambiguous. On March 13th, before Napoleon had even reached Paris, the powers assembled at Vienna declared him an outlaw, not a sovereign, not a head of state, an outlaw, beyond the pale of civil and social relations, Reichern subject to public prosecution. The declaration was signed by Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and every minor power that the great powers could pressure into signing. It meant that there would be no negotiation. There would be no recognition. There would be war, and the war would not end until Napoleon was removed. The coalition committed to putting more than 700,000 men into the field. The forces would converge on France from every direction. Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Blücher's Prussians from the north through Belgium, Austrian armies from the east through the Rhine and the Alps, Russian armies marching west across Germany, weeks away but inexorably approaching. Napoleon's options were narrow. He could not wait for the coalition to assemble its full strength. The numbers were too lopsided. He had approximately 300,000 men available, with another 100,000 being organized and equipped. If he waited, he would face odds of more than 2 to 1. If he struck quickly before the Russian and Austrian armies arrived, he might defeat the nearest enemies, Wellington and Blücher, in detail, knock them out of the war, and use the victory to fracture the coalition politically, exploiting the divisions and war weariness that he knew existed beneath the surface of Allied unity. It was the Italian campaign all over again: speed, concentration. The central position: defeat the enemy separately before they could unite. The strategy was sound. It had worked before. Whether it could work again against opponents who had spent years learning how to counter it was the question on which everything now depended. In early June, Napoleon moved his army north, toward the Belgian frontier, where Wellington's force of approximately 68,000 men and Blücher's force of approximately 120,000 were deployed in a loose cordon, not yet concentrated, separated by enough distance that a fast-moving army could drive between them. He crossed the frontier on June 15th. The campaign that followed lasted 4 days. The Waterloo campaign has been analyzed, debated, reconstructed, and second-guessed more exhaustively than any comparable military operation in history. Every decision has been scrutinized. Every delay has been measured. Every what-if has been explored with the obsessive thoroughness that attends events whose consequences were vast and whose margins were small. The broad outline is this. Napoleon's plan was to advance rapidly into Belgium, place his army between Wellington and Blücher, and defeat each in succession. On June 16th, he engaged Blücher's Prussians at Ligny, the last battle Napoleon would ever win. The Prussians were driven back with heavy casualties, roughly 16,000 men. And Blücher himself was unhorsed, ridden over by French cavalry and nearly killed. The victory was real but incomplete. The Prussian army was battered, not destroyed. It retreated north toward Wavre rather than east, toward its supply lines, a distinction that would prove decisive, because a retreat north meant a retreat toward Wellington rather than away from him. Napoleon detached Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the Prussians and prevent them from rejoining Wellington. Grouchy, a cavalry general of adequate talent and limited imagination, pursued methodically, slowly, following the letter of his orders without grasping their spirit. The spirit of the orders was keep the Prussians away from Wellington at all costs. Grouchy interpreted this as follow the Prussian rearguard. The distinction would cost Napoleon his empire. Meanwhile, Wellington had concentrated his army at a position he had identified months earlier, a low ridge south of the village of Waterloo, along the road to Brussels, near a farmstead called Mont Saint-Jean. The position was strong. The ridge provided a reverse slope that sheltered his infantry from direct artillery fire. The farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, fortified and garrisoned, anchored the flanks and center. Wellington, who had spent 6 years fighting Napoleon's marshals in Spain, understood the French way of war intimately. The massed columns, the artillery preparation, the cavalry charges, and he had chosen ground that neutralized each of these advantages in turn. Wellington had also received a promise from Blücher. The Prussians would march to join him. They would arrive during the battle, striking Napoleon's right flank while Wellington held the front. Everything depended on timing. June 18th, 1815. The morning was wet. It had rained heavily the night before, a thunderstorm of almost theatrical intensity, and the ground was sodden. Napoleon delayed his attack until late morning, waiting for the earth to dry enough for his artillery to maneuver and his cavalry to charge effectively. The delay cost him hours that the Prussians were using to march west from Wavre. The battle began around 11:30. Napoleon's plan was direct: a heavy artillery bombardment followed by massed infantry assaults against Wellington's center, designed to break the Allied line before the Prussians could arrive. It was not a subtle plan. It lacked the geometric elegance of Austerlitz, the sweeping maneuver of Ulm, the calculated misdirection of Jena. It was a frontal attack against a prepared position, and it reflected either Napoleon's confidence that his veterans could break any line, or his recognition that time was too short for anything more sophisticated. The fighting at Hougoumont, the fortified chateau on Wellington's right, began first and consumed French troops all day without producing a decisive result. Napoleon's brother Jérôme led the initial assault, and the fighting escalated as both sides fed reinforcements into a struggle for a single building complex, a microcosm of the larger battle's attritional character. The great infantry assault against Wellington's center came in the early afternoon. Durland's corps, roughly 16,000 men, advanced in dense columns across the valley that separated the two ridges, into a crossfire of musketry and artillery that tore gaps in their formation with every step. The columns reached the ridge. Some penetrated the Allied line. For a few critical minutes, the outcome of the battle hung on the behavior of a few thousand men fighting hand-to-hand in the mud and the smoke along a farm track. Wellington's cavalry, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, heavy horsemen on fresh mounts, countercharged. The effect was devastating. Durland's corps was thrown back down the slope in disorder, leaving thousands of dead and wounded on the field. The cavalry, overexcited and undisciplined, charged too far, reached the French guns, and were in turn cut apart by French lancers. The charge had saved Wellington's center and destroyed some of his best cavalry in the same action. The afternoon brought the cavalry charges, wave after wave of French horsemen led by Ney, hurling themselves against the Allied squares on the ridge. The squares held. They held because Wellington's infantry was disciplined enough to maintain formation under conditions of extraordinary terror. Thousands of horses thundering toward them, the ground shaking, the riders slashing with sabers. And because cavalry without infantry support could not break a properly formed square, Ney sent the cavalry in without infantry. He sent them without sufficient artillery preparation. He sent them because he was Ney, because courage was his only mode, and because at Waterloo courage was not enough. As the afternoon wore on, the first Prussian units began arriving on Napoleon's right flank, Bülow's corps, then Zieten's. The pressure was mounting. Napoleon committed his reserves piecemeal to contain the Prussian advance, forces that he needed to break Wellington's line and could no longer spare. The crisis came in the early evening. La Haye-Sainte, the fortified farmhouse in the center of Wellington's position, fell to the French at approximately 6:30. Ney, seizing the opportunity, pushed infantry forward to the crest of the ridge. Wellington's center was thin, desperately thin, and for a few minutes the battle was genuinely in doubt. Ney sent urgent messages to Napoleon requesting reinforcements. The Imperial Guard, send the guard, the center could be broken. Napoleon hesitated. The Prussians were pressing on his right. He had already committed part of the guard to contain them. The reserves were shrinking. The calculation that had always been his supreme gift, was clouded by the smoke, the noise, the confusion, and perhaps by the physical and mental exhaustion of a man who had been fighting, in one form or another, for 23 years. He sent the guard too late, or he sent them at the wrong point, or the moment had passed. The debate continues. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, Napoleon committed the Imperial Guard to a final assault on Wellington's right center, the Guard, the Old Guard, the Middle Guard, the men who had never retreated, who carried themselves with the ferocious pride of soldiers who considered themselves the finest infantry in the world, formed up in columns and marched up the slope toward the Allied line. They marched into a trap. Wellington had positioned Maitland's Guards Brigade behind the crest of the ridge, invisible from below, lying in the tall rye. As the Imperial Guard reached the crest, Wellington gave the order, the famous order, though the exact words are disputed. Now, Maitland, now's your time. Or perhaps, stand up, guards, or perhaps simply, fire. 1,500 British guardsmen rose from the grain and delivered a volley at point-blank range into the front of the advancing column. The effect was shattering. The Imperial Guard, the guard that had never broken, wavered. Colborne's 52nd Regiment wheeled in from the flank and poured enfilade fire into their side. The guard fell back. The word spread across the battlefield with the speed of panic. La Garde recule! The guard is retreating. The guard, which had never retreated, was retreating. The French army broke, not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, on the sudden catastrophic collapse of morale that occurs when an army discovers, in a single moment, that the thing it believed most firmly is no longer true. The Imperial Guard was not invincible. Napoleon was not invincible. The spell was broken. Wellington raised his hat and waved it forward. The entire Allied line advanced. From the east, the Prussians surged forward, rolling up the French right flank. The rout was total. The French army dissolved into a fleeing mob, pursued through the gathering darkness by Prussian cavalry that showed no mercy. Napoleon left the field. The accounts of his departure vary. Some say he was swept away by the retreating tide. Some say he attempted to rally the guard for a last stand. Some say he sought death in the melee and was dragged away by his aides. What is certain is that by nightfall, he was riding south, and behind him, on the slopes below Mont-Saint-Jean, approximately 25,000 French soldiers lay dead or wounded, and the empire, the Second Empire, the impossible empire, the empire that had lasted 100 days, was finished. The butcher's bill at Waterloo was paid by every nation that fought there. Wellington's army lost approximately 15,000 killed and wounded. The Prussians lost roughly 7,000. The French losses were the highest, and the pursuit that followed the battle added thousands more to the toll. Men cut down on the roads, men who surrendered and were sometimes killed anyway, men who simply sat down in the fields and waited for whatever came next. Wellington, surveying the field that night, said, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." The remark has the ring of calculated understatement, but the witnesses who recorded it reported that Wellington was visibly shaken, pale, exhausted, near tears as the casualty reports came in, reading the names of officers he had known for years who were now dead in the churned mud below the ridge. The dead of Waterloo, French, British, Prussian, Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian men from a dozen nations who had been arranged on that field by forces they did not control and could not refuse, lay in the open for days. The local civilians who came to strip the bodies found them piled 3 and 4 deep in places, intertwined, French and British lying together in postures that suggested they had died grappling with each other. Surgeons worked for days. The wounded who could not be moved were left in the farmhouses and the fields, and many of them died slowly of shock and infection and thirst, calling for water that no one brought. This was the cost. This was always the cost. And Napoleon, riding south through the night, had been paying it with other people's lives for 20 years. He reached Paris on June 21st. The city he entered was not the city that had carried him on its shoulders 3 months earlier. The mood was different. The chambers, the legislature he had reconstituted under the Acte Additionnel, were in session, and they were not sympathetic. Fouché, the minister of police, that most durable of survivors, was already maneuvering to remove Napoleon and negotiate with the Allies. Lafayette, the same Lafayette who had fought in the American Revolution, who had been a hero of 1789, who had somehow survived every subsequent upheaval, stood in the chamber and declared that Napoleon's abdication was necessary for the survival of France. Napoleon considered resistance. He considered dissolving the chambers. He considered declaring himself dictator and calling the nation to arms in a final apocalyptic defense. He did not. Perhaps he was too exhausted. Perhaps he understood, as he had not understood at Fontainebleau, that the game was truly finished. Perhaps he looked at the faces of the men around him and saw what Ney had told him a year earlier, that France would no longer follow where he led. On June 22, 1815, he abdicated for the second time in favor of his 4-year-old son, whom he proclaimed Napoleon II. The proclamation was a gesture without substance. No one intended to honor it. He lingered in Paris for a few days, then moved to Malmaison, Josephine's house, the house where they had been happy, or as close to happy as either of them had managed. Josephine was dead. She had died the previous year of pneumonia at the age of 50. Napoleon walked through the rooms. He looked at her things. Then he went west toward the coast, toward Rochefort, where he hoped to find a ship that would carry him to America. He had a vision, vague, romantic, impractical, of a life in the United States, a retirement among free men, perhaps a scientific expedition, perhaps a quiet farm. The vision was a fantasy. The British Navy was blockading every French port, and the Allies had made it clear that Napoleon would not be permitted to escape. At Rochefort, he found 2 frigates but no possibility of running the British blockade. The options narrowed. He could flee in a small boat disguised and hope to slip past the patrols. He could remain in France, where capture by the Prussians, who wanted to execute him, or by the Bourbons, who might do worse, was a near certainty. Or he could surrender to the British, throwing himself on what he described in a letter to the Prince Regent as the generosity of the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of his enemies. On July 15th, 1815, Napoleon boarded HMS Bellerophon, a 74-gun ship of the line that had fought at the Nile and at Trafalgar, and surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland. He came aboard with a small entourage, generals, servants, a few faithful companions, and he came with the expectation, or at least the hope, that Britain would grant him asylum. A country house in the English countryside, a quiet retirement under surveillance, something civilized. The British government had other plans. The decision to send Napoleon to St. Helena was made in London by men who had never met him and who had no intention of making the same mistake twice. Elba had been too close to France, too close to Italy, too close to the networks of loyalty and information that had permitted his escape. The next exile would be, in every sense, final. St. Helena is a volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly 1,200 miles west of the African coast, roughly 1,800 miles east of Brazil, roughly 4,000 miles from London, and roughly as far from anything that mattered to European politics as it was possible to be while remaining on the surface of the earth. It is small, approximately 10 miles long, 6 miles wide, and it is steep. The coastline is a wall of dark basalt cliffs, 600 to 1,000 feet high in places, rising from a sea that breaks against their bases with a violence that makes landing difficult even in favorable conditions. The interior is a landscape of ravines, ridges, and narrow plateaus, some of them green with tropical vegetation, others bare and wind-scoured. The climate is mild but relentlessly damp. Clouds settle over the highlands for weeks at a time, producing a fog that contemporaries described as oppressive, clinging, almost sentient in its persistence. The island had been a possession of the British East India Company since the 17th century, a way station for ships rounding the Cape of Good Hope on the long passage between Europe and Asia. Its population was small, roughly 5,000 people, a mixture of British soldiers, company employees, enslaved Africans and their descendants, Chinese laborers, and a handful of free settlers. It was, by any standard, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. Napoleon arrived on October 15, 1815, aboard HMS Northumberland, after a voyage of 10 weeks. He had spent the journey reading, dictating, playing cards with his small entourage, and studying English, a language he had never troubled to learn during the years when English-speaking nations were his principal enemies. He had also absorbed during the voyage the terms of his captivity, and he had not absorbed them well. He would be confined to the island for the duration of his natural life. He would be guarded by a garrison of more than 2,000 British soldiers. He would be accompanied by a governor whose primary responsibility was to ensure that he did not escape. He would be addressed not as emperor but as General Bonaparte, a demotion of title that Napoleon regarded as an insult so profound that it colored every subsequent interaction with his British custodians. He would be permitted to move freely within a defined perimeter around his residence, but any excursion beyond that perimeter required an escort. He would be permitted to receive visitors, but all visitors would be screened. His correspondence would be read. The residence assigned to him was Longwood House, a former cattle ranch on the island's wind-swept eastern plateau. It had been hastily expanded and renovated to accommodate an emperor in exile, but the renovations were inadequate, and the location was terrible. The house was damp. The walls sweated. The roof leaked. The plateau was exposed to the southeast trade winds, which blew almost without cease, carrying moisture and a fine grit that infiltrated everything. The furniture was insufficient. The garden was rudimentary. Rats were endemic. The nearest settlement of any consequence, Jamestown, was several miles away down a precipitous road. Napoleon hated it. He hated the house, the climate, the island, the confinement, and above all the governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, who arrived in April 1816 to replace the more accommodating Admiral Cockburn, and who would become, in Napoleon's telling and in the mythology that followed, the villain of the exile years. Lowe was a career soldier, competent, methodical, and devoid of imagination. He had been given an impossible assignment: to keep the most famous prisoner in the world securely confined while treating him with sufficient courtesy to avoid international scandal, and he executed it with a rigid literalism that was, depending on one's perspective, either professional diligence or petty cruelty. He enforced the rule about Napoleon's title with pedantic consistency. He restricted Napoleon's movements. He reduced his household budget. He insisted on personally verifying Napoleon's presence on the island at regular intervals, a requirement that Napoleon found humiliating and that produced encounters of escalating hostility. The relationship between Napoleon and Lowe became, over the 6 years of exile, a kind of miniature war. A conflict of wills fought with bureaucratic memoranda, social slights, and the weaponized deployment of dignity. Napoleon refused to see Lowe. Lowe insisted on protocol. Napoleon complained to visiting officials. Lowe tightened restrictions. Each man believed the other was acting in bad faith, and each was probably correct. The justice of Napoleon's complaints about his treatment is a question that admits different answers depending on what one considers the baseline for the imprisonment of a deposed emperor responsible for the deaths of millions. By the standards of 20th century political imprisonment, his conditions were uncomfortable but not inhumane. He had servants, companions, books, wine, food that was adequate if not luxurious, and a degree of personal freedom that a modern political prisoner would envy. By the standards that Napoleon himself considered appropriate, the standards of a sovereign, an emperor, a man who had dined off gold plate in the Tuileries, they were degrading. The truth is that both frames were simultaneously operative, and the dissonance between them was the source of much of the exile's psychological torment. Napoleon was at once a prisoner and a former emperor, at once a man under guard and a figure of world historical significance, and the British government's refusal to acknowledge the second identity while enforcing the first was experienced by Napoleon as an act of sustained violence against his selfhood. Whether the British government owed him that acknowledgement is, of course, an entirely different question. What Napoleon did on St. Helena, what he spent the remaining 6 years of his life doing, was, in its way, as consequential as anything he had done on the battlefield. He dictated his memoirs. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the final campaign. A campaign waged not with armies but with words, not for territory but for posterity. And it was conducted with the same strategic intelligence, the same instinct for the decisive point, and the same willingness to sacrifice truth for effect that had characterized every previous campaign. The memoirs were dictated to a rotating cast of companions and secretaries, Las Cases, Gourgaud, Montholon, Bertrand, men who had followed him into exile and who served in this final period as both audience and amanuensis. The process was not systematic. Napoleon dictated in bursts, sometimes for hours, sometimes abandoning a subject mid-sentence, returning to it days or weeks later, layering revision upon revision until the original account was buried beneath strata of reconsideration and self-justification. The result, published in various forms after his death, most notably as the Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène compiled by Las Cases, was a masterpiece of narrative construction. It was also, by any historian standard, profoundly unreliable. Napoleon rewrote his own history with the same authority he had once used to rewrite the map of Europe. He minimized his defeats. He exaggerated his victories. He blamed his subordinates for failures that were plainly his own. Grouchy at Waterloo, his marshals in Spain, the weather in Russia, as though the weather were a subordinate who had failed to follow orders. He presented himself as a child of the revolution, a servant of the people, a liberal emperor who had sought to unite Europe under the principles of 1789 and had been prevented from doing so only by the reactionary jealousy of the old monarchies. The narrative was brilliant. It was also, in essential respects, false. Napoleon had not been a liberal. He had not been a servant of the people. He had been an autocrat of extraordinary ability who had used the language of the revolution to legitimize a personal dictatorship and who had subordinated every principle, liberty, equality, fraternity, to the requirements of his own power. The wars had not been defensive. The continental system had not been benign. The invasion of Spain had not been a liberation. The invasion of Russia had not been a necessity. But the narrative worked. It worked because it was simple, because it was compelling, because it gave shape and meaning to 20 years of chaos and bloodshed, and because the man telling it was Napoleon, and Napoleon's voice, even at its most self-serving charisma, carried an authority that lesser memoirists could not match. The memoirs became the foundation of the Napoleonic legend, the template from which every subsequent telling of the story, including inevitably this one, has drawn. Every biographer of Napoleon writes in dialogue with the memoirs, accepting some claims, rejecting others, but always responding to the framework that Napoleon himself constructed. He was, in this sense, the author of his own myth. And the myth, like the Code Napoleon, outlived the man. The daily reality of exile was considerably less grand than the myth-making might suggest. Napoleon rose late, a reversal of the early rising habit that had marked his years in power. He breakfasted, he dictated, he gardened, tending a small plot that he had carved from Longwood's unpromising soil with a determination that his companions found both touching and faintly absurd. He read, voraciously as he had always read, consuming books on every subject, annotating them with the same cramped handwriting that had tormented his secretaries for 30 years. He played chess. He argued with his companions, who were themselves confined to the island, and who over the years developed the irritability and mutual resentment that afflicts any small group of people trapped in close quarters for too long. Gourgaud quarreled with Montholon. Las Casas was expelled from the island by Lowe in 1816, ostensibly for attempting to smuggle correspondence. Gourgaud left in 1818 bitter and unwell. The household shrank. The world shrank. The horizon, which had once encompassed Moscow and Madrid and Cairo, now terminated at the edge of a damp plateau on a rock in the Atlantic. Napoleon grew fat. The lean, sharp-featured young general of Italy, the trim first consul, the imperial figure in the coronation portrait, these were gone. The man on St. Helena was heavy, soft, increasingly sedentary. His health deteriorated. He complained of pain in his side, in his stomach. He vomited. He lost his appetite, then regained it, then lost it again. The British doctors who examined him, not the one when he consented to be examined, which was not often, offered diagnoses that ranged from hepatitis to hypochondria. Napoleon distrusted them. He distrusted everyone associated with his captors. The question of what killed Napoleon has been debated for 2 centuries and has generated a cottage industry of medical speculation, conspiracy theory, and retrospective diagnosis. The autopsy, performed on May 6, 1821, by Napoleon's personal physician François Antomarchi, and observed by several British doctors, found a large cancerous ulcer in the stomach, a finding consistent with the gastric cancer that had killed Napoleon's father, Carlo, at the age of 38. The cancer explanation is the one accepted by most historians and most physicians who have reviewed the evidence, but there is a persistent alternative theory, persistent enough to warrant mention, though not enough to compel belief, that Napoleon was poisoned. The proposed agent is arsenic, administered gradually over years, perhaps in his wine, perhaps in the wallpaper of Longwood House, which contained an arsenic-based pigment common in the period. Hair samples taken from Napoleon's body after death have been tested repeatedly and have shown elevated levels of arsenic, though whether these levels are consistent with poisoning, environmental exposure, or the normal arsenic content of 19th century hair treatments is a matter of scientific dispute. The poisoning theory has a certain narrative appeal. The great man brought low not by disease but by treachery, killed by his captors or by a traitor within his own household. The most commonly proposed suspect is Montholon, whose motives are variously attributed to personal resentment, political ambition, or the influence of the Bourbon government, which would have had reason to want Napoleon dead. The evidence, however, is circumstantial, and the cancer explanation is both simpler and better supported by the clinical record. What is not in dispute is the decline. Through 1820 and into 1821, Napoleon grew weaker. The stomach pains intensified. He vomited blood. He could not eat. He spent more and more time in bed, in the damp rooms of Longwood House, attended by companions who watched him diminish and could do nothing. He knew he was dying. He dictated his will, a detailed, meticulous document that disposed of his possessions, named his heirs, expressed his wishes for his burial, and contained embedded among the practical provisions a sentence that was both a final political statement and a final act of self-creation. I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine in the midst of that French people which I have loved so much. The sentence is perfect. It is generous, sentimental, patriotic, and subtly coercive. It places the obligation of honor on France, implying that to deny him a French burial would be to betray the mutual love between emperor and people. Even in his will, Napoleon was making moves. On May 5, 1821, at approximately 5:49 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51 years old. He had been on St. Helena for 5 years, 5 months, and 21 days. The accounts of his last hours are multiple and contradictory, as the accounts of significant deaths tend to be. Antomarchi was present. Montholon was present. Bertrand, the most loyal of his companions, was present. The British garrison was informed. The governor was notified. The protocols of death in captivity were observed with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that had characterized the captivity itself. His last words are disputed. The most commonly cited version is France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine. France, the army, head of the army, Joséphine. The words are fragmentary, delirious, the last signals from a mind that was shutting down, and their arrangement may owe more to the memories of those who recorded them than to the intentions of the man who uttered them. But the elements, France, the army, Joséphine, feel right. They were the three fixed points of his life: the country he had claimed as his own, the instrument through which he had exercised his will, and the woman he had loved most and treated worst. He was buried on St. Helena, in a small valley called Seine Valley, later renamed the Valley of the Tomb, beneath a simple stone slab without a name. He had requested that if he could not be buried in France, his grave should bear the inscription Napoleon and nothing else. Lowe insisted on Napoleon Bonaparte. Neither side would yield, and so the stone was left blank, an emperor's grave, unmarked on a rock in the middle of the ocean. The image has a finality that borders on the mythic, and like most things about Napoleon's story, the finality was not final. The body did not remain on St. Helena. In 1840, 19 years after Napoleon's death, the French government of King Louis-Philippe, himself a product of the 1830 revolution that had finally expelled the Bourbons for good, negotiated the return of Napoleon's remains. The decision was political. Louis-Philippe, a constitutional monarch of liberal temperament and uncertain legitimacy, needed the reflected glory of the Napoleonic legend to strengthen his hold on power. Bringing Napoleon home was a gesture designed to unite a fractured nation around its most potent historical symbol. The ship that carried the remains was, with a sense of occasion that Napoleon would have appreciated, named the Belle Poule. The exhumation, conducted on October 15, 1840, produced a detail that passed immediately into legend. When the coffin was opened, 19 years after burial, Napoleon's body was reportedly well preserved, recognizable, intact, the features still discernible. The phenomenon was attributed by some to the airtight seal of the multiple coffins in which he had been interred. Others attributed it to less natural causes. The romantic interpretation of it being that even death could not fully claim him was the one that endured. The remains arrived in France in December 1840, and the funeral procession through Paris was one of the most spectacular public events of the 19th century. The coffin was carried on an enormous gilded hearse drawn by 16 horses through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of spectators who stood in freezing temperatures to witness the passage. Veterans of the Grande Armée, old men now, gray and stooped, some of them missing limbs, all of them carrying memories that no one else alive could share, lined the route. Some wept, some saluted, some simply stood in silence, watching the coffin pass, remembering. Napoleon was interred in the Hôtel des Invalides, in a massive porphyry sarcophagus that sits in a circular crypt beneath the dome, surrounded by the battle flags of his campaigns. The tomb was designed to force visitors to look down at the sarcophagus from above, a choice that has been interpreted as either humbling the viewer before Napoleon's greatness, or conversely diminishing Napoleon by placing him below the viewer's line of sight. The ambiguity may be intentional. It is certainly appropriate. He lies there still. The legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte is not a single thing. It is a field of contradictions, a landscape as contested as any battlefield he ever crossed, and the contest shows no sign of resolution. Begin with what can be measured. The legal legacy is the most concrete. The Code Napoleon remains the foundation of civil law in France and in the dozens of countries whose legal systems derive from the French model. The principles it established, equality before the law, the sanctity of contract, the protection of private property, the secular character of the state, and are so deeply embedded in the legal architecture of the modern world that they have become invisible, like the foundations of a building that no one thinks to examine because the building is standing. This is Napoleon's most durable achievement, and it is an achievement that was produced not by his sword, but by his capacity for sustained, detailed, unglamorous administrative work. The 57 council sessions, the midnight dictation, the relentless attention to the wording of articles that would govern the lives of millions. The institutional legacy extends beyond the law. The prefectural system, the lycées, the Bank of France, the Concordat, the Legion of Honor, the metric system which Napoleon promoted and standardized across his empire. These are structures that survived his fall, survived the Bourbon Restoration, survived the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, survived the Second Empire of Napoleon III, survived the Third Republic and the Fourth and the Fifth, and continue to function today. They are the skeleton of the modern French state, and they were assembled in their essential form during the 4 years of the Consulate by a man who understood that power exercised through institutions is more durable than power exercised through armies. The geopolitical legacy is more ambiguous. Napoleon's wars destroyed the old European order, the Holy Roman Empire, the Ancien Regime, the system of small states and feudal privileges that had characterized the continent for centuries, and replaced it with something that was, in its way, more rational but not necessarily more humane. The consolidation of Germany that Napoleon initiated would lead, through a chain of consequences that he could not have foreseen and that no one planned, to the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership in 1871. An event that reshaped European power politics, produced 2 world wars, and killed tens of millions of people. Napoleon did not cause the First World War, but the Europe in which the First World War became possible was, in significant part, a Europe that Napoleon had made. The nationalist movements that swept the continent in the 19th century, in Italy, in Germany, in Poland, in Greece, in the Balkans, drew energy from the same forces that Napoleon had both embodied and unleashed. The idea that a people defined by language, culture, and shared history had the right to govern themselves, an idea that was subversive of every multinational empire on the continent, was an idea that Napoleon had exploited without believing in, and that outlived him because it answered a need that no restoration could suppress. The military legacy is studied in every staff college in the world, though the lessons drawn from it vary. Napoleon demonstrated that speed, concentration, and decisive engagement could produce results out of proportion to the forces employed. He also demonstrated, as at Moscow, at Leipzig, at Waterloo, that these principles have limits, that an enemy who refuses to cooperate with your operational assumptions can neutralize them, and that strategic overextension will eventually defeat any amount of tactical brilliance. The human cost defies easy summary. The wars killed somewhere between 3 and 6 million people, depending on how the boundaries of the conflict are drawn and which populations are counted. The demographic impact on France was measurable for decades. A generation of young men consumed by the conscription machine, a deficit of births that showed up in the population statistics well into the middle of the century. The impact on the rest of Europe was comparable or worse. Spain was devastated. Russia lost hundreds of thousands. The German states, the Italian peninsula, Poland, the Low Countries, every region that served as a theater of operations bore scars that took a generation to heal. And the people who bore the heaviest cost, the conscripts who marched, the civilians who starved, the women who survived, the enslaved, and the colonized whose labor sustained the empires on both sides, are the people whose voices are most absent from the record. The Napoleonic Wars are remembered as a clash of great men, great armies, and great ideas. They were also a sustained catastrophe inflicted on ordinary people by forces they could not control. And the ordinary people left behind few memoirs, few letters, few testimonies that the archive chose to preserve. We know Napoleon. We know Wellington. We know Kutuzov and Blücher and Talleyrand and Metternich. We do not know the name of the boy who froze to death on the road from Moscow, or the woman who watched the French army burn her village in Andalusia, or the Egyptian prisoner who was bayoneted on the beach at Jaffa. They are the dark matter of this history, invisible, essential, constituting the greater part of its mass. Napoleon himself becomes, at this distance, less a person than a problem of interpretation, of moral accounting, of the relationship between individual ability and collective consequence. He was, by any honest assessment, one of the most gifted human beings who ever exercised political and military power. The speed of his mind, the scope of his vision, the intensity of his will. These were extraordinary, and they produced results that were, in their way, extraordinary. The Code Napoleon is extraordinary, Austerlitz is extraordinary, the administrative reconstruction of France is extraordinary, but the gifts were deployed in the service of an ambition that recognized no boundary except the material limits of what force could achieve. Napoleon did not seek power in order to accomplish something beyond power itself. The reforms, the laws, the institutions, these were genuine achievements, but they were also instruments of control, means of consolidating a dominance that was, in the end, its own purpose. He built an empire because he could. He fought wars because fighting was what he did. He could not stop. Not at the natural boundaries of France, not at the Treaty of Tilsit, not at the gates of Moscow, because stopping would have required him to be someone other than who he was. This is not a moral judgment, or rather, it is a moral judgment that refuses to resolve itself into a verdict. Napoleon was not a monster. He was not a savior. He was a man of extraordinary capabilities and extraordinary limitations, who operated in a world that his capabilities reshaped and his limitations ultimately destroyed. The same intelligence that won Austerlitz led him to Moscow. The same will that rebuilt France drove him to refuse every peace that did not confirm his supremacy. The same instinct for the decisive point that made him the greatest general of his age made him incapable of recognizing that some problems, the British Navy, the Spanish resistance, the Russian winter, the fundamental unwillingness of other nations to accept permanent French hegemony, did not have decisive points. He saw further than anyone around him. He could not see his own limits. And the gap between those two forms of vision is where the tragedy lives. There is a painting by Jacques-Louis David, the most famous of Napoleon's image makers, the man who choreographed the visual mythology of the empire with the same precision that Napoleon brought to his campaigns, that hangs in the Château de Malmaison. It shows Napoleon crossing the Alps on a rearing white horse, his cloak billowing behind him, his hand raised in a gesture that is at once a command and an invitation, the mountains receding beneath him as though even geography had agreed to submit. The painting was commissioned in 1801 after the Marengo campaign, and it is magnificent, it is stirring. It is, in almost every particular, a lie. Napoleon did not cross the Alps on a white charger. He crossed on a mule, led by a local guide, picking his way along frozen paths that offered a plausible chance of killing him at every turn. The mule was the sensible choice. A mule is sure-footed where a horse is not. A mule does not rear. A mule does not care about posterity. David knew this, Napoleon told him. And David painted the horse anyway because the painting was not a record of what happened. It was a record of what the moment was supposed to mean. The gap between those two things, between what happened and what it was supposed to mean, is the space in which Napoleon's legacy has lived for 200 years. Every generation since his death has painted its own version of the man on the horse. The Romantics saw a Titan, Byron's Pagode, Beethoven's original dedicatee, the spirit of human will unchained. Beethoven scratched out the dedication when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, recognizing that the man he had admired had become the thing he despised. And the gesture of erasure was itself a form of homage. Only a figure of genuine significance could provoke that level of disappointment. Hegel, watching Napoleon ride through Jena in 1806, reportedly called him the world soul on horseback. A phrase so grandiose that it sounds like parody, except that Hegel meant it, or meant something by it that his philosophy required him to mean. The Romantics needed Napoleon because they needed proof that a single human will could bend history to its shape. and Napoleon for a time had provided that proof. The liberals saw something different. They saw the betrayer of the revolution of Biouam, the man who took the principles of 1789 and used them as raw material for personal dictatorship, who replaced the tyranny of kings with the tyranny of genius and called it liberation. Benjamin Constant, who had drafted Napoleon's liberal constitution during the 100 Days, and who understood both the appeal and the danger of Napoleonic power better than most, wrote that Napoleon had corrupted the best cause by associating it with his ambition. The liberal critique was not that Napoleon was evil, it was that he was seductive, that the spectacle of competence and power made it easy to forget what competence and power actually cost. The nationalists, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, saw a unifier, or a precursor of unification. Italian nationalists invoked Napoleon as the man who had first given Italy the experience of unified governance, however briefly and however exploitatively. Polish nationalists remembered the Duchy of Warsaw as a promise of independence that had been made and broken, but that proved the possibility of Polish statehood. German nationalists had a more complicated relationship. Napoleon had consolidated Germany and humiliated it simultaneously, and the memory of both acts fueled the national movement that eventually produced Bismarck, the Franco-Prussian War, and the German Empire that emerged from it. The Marxists saw a class instrument, the sword arm of the bourgeoisie, the man who consolidated the economic gains of the revolution for the propertied classes while crushing the radical energies that might have produced a genuinely egalitarian society. There is something to this reading. The Code Napoleon was, among other things, a charter of property rights, and the society it encoded was one in which the old aristocracy of blood had been replaced not by equality, but by a new aristocracy of wealth, no less hierarchical and, in some respects, less charitable toward those at the bottom. The militarists, and there have been many in many countries across many decades, saw a master of war, a practitioner whose campaigns could be studied the way musicians study Bach, for the purity of the structure, the elegance of the execution, the way every element serves the whole. Clausewitz, who fought against Napoleon and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened to him, built his theory of war largely in response to the Napoleonic experience. The concept of the decisive battle, the emphasis on the destruction of the enemy's army as the primary objective, the relationship between war and politics. These Clausewitzian ideas were forged in the crucible of the Napoleonic Wars and shaped military thinking for the next century, with consequences that Clausewitz himself might not have endorsed. And then there is the view from below, the view that has no single spokesman, no canonical text, no painting in a museum. The view of the conscript's mother, the burned village, the amputated limb, the child who grew up without a father because the father was buried in a mass grave outside Borodino, or drowned in the Berezina, or bled to death in a Spanish ditch. This view does not produce grand narratives. It does not weigh achievements against costs on a historical balance sheet. It simply records the fact that the achievements were purchased with the lives of people who were not consulted about the price and who received none of the proceeds. The tension between these views is between the genius and the cost, between the builder and the destroyer, between the lawgiver and the warlord, is not a problem to be solved. It is the thing itself. It is Napoleon. The 19th century, which Napoleon did more to shape than any other single individual, spent much of its duration arguing about him, and the arguments generated consequences that extended far beyond the academic. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, leveraged the family name into the presidency of the Second French Republic in 1848, and then, in 1851, into an imperial throne of his own, becoming Napoleon III. The path was remarkably similar to his uncle's. A republic weakened by instability, a popular plebiscite, a coup d'etat dressed in democratic clothing, and the echo was intentional. Louis Napoleon understood that the Napoleonic legend was a political resource more powerful than any party or program, and he exploited it with a skill that his uncle might have recognized and his uncle's ghost might have envied. Napoleon III's Second Empire lasted 18 years, considerably longer than the first, and it produced its own legacy. The rebuilding of Paris under Haussmann, the expansion of the French colonial empire, the modernization of French industry and finance. It also produced its own catastrophe. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, in which the French army was crushed at Sedan, Napoleon III was captured, and the Second Empire collapsed with a completeness that recalled the First Empire's end, though without the grandeur. Napoleon III died in exile in England in 1873, a largely forgotten figure overshadowed by the uncle whose name he had borrowed. The Napoleonic legend, however, did not die with either Napoleon. It persisted, mutating with each generation, adapting to the needs of each new political moment. In France, it became a permanent feature of the political landscape, invoked by authoritarians and Democrats alike, a reservoir of national pride and a warning about the seductions of personal power depending on who was doing the invoking. De Gaulle, who understood the psychology of French national identity better than any 20th century politician, drew consciously on the Napoleonic template, the solitary figure of authority, the personal mystique, the relationship between leader and nation that bypassed institutions and spoke directly to something in the collective soul. De Gaulle was not Napoleon. He was a Democrat, however imperious his style, but he operated in the space that Napoleon had opened, the space in which a single individual could embody the state. And the French accepted it because Napoleon had taught them 2 centuries earlier that such embodiment was possible. Outside France, the legend served different purposes. For the peoples of Europe who had been subjects of multinational empires, some Italians, the Poles, the Germans, the Greeks, the Hungarians, Napoleon was a catalyst, a man who had demonstrated, however briefly, that the old order could be overthrown, that borders could be redrawn, that nations could be created by acts of will rather than inherited by accidents of dynasty. The fact that Napoleon himself had been an imperialist, that his nation-building had been a tool of French dominance rather than an expression of genuine self-determination, was a complication that the nationalist movements of the 19th century tended to overlook, or to regard as secondary to the larger truth that the old certainties were no longer certain. For Britain, Napoleon was the great adversary, the dragon that St. George had slain, the threat against which British identity could be defined. Wellington and Nelson became national saints, their victories at Waterloo and Trafalgar the foundational myths of British imperial confidence. The century of relative peace that followed 1815, the Pax Britannica, sustained by naval supremacy and the balance of power that the Congress of Vienna had established, was understood in British telling as the reward for having defeated Napoleon. The British Empire that expanded across the 19th century did so in the confidence that it had earned the right to global dominance by saving Europe from French tyranny. The irony that this confidence produced its own forms of tyranny in India, in Africa, in Ireland, across the colonized world were keys was an irony that the British imperial class was poorly equipped to perceive. For Russia, the defeat of Napoleon in 1812 became the central event of national mythology. The moment when the Russian soul, expressed through the endurance of the Russian soldier and the vastness of the Russian land, proved itself against the most formidable military force the world had ever seen. Tolstoy built War and Peace around it, a novel that is, among many other things, an argument that Napoleon's genius was an illusion, that the movements of armies are determined not by the decisions of commanders, but by the aggregate of millions of individual wills, and that the Russian victory was a victory of the Russian people, not of any general or czar. The argument is philosophically interesting and historically debatable, but its power as national narrative is immense, and it echoed through Russian culture for generations, resurfacing in the Second World War, when the defense of Moscow against Hitler's armies was explicitly framed as a repetition of 1812. The echoes multiplied. Every subsequent European war was, in some sense, fought in Napoleon's shadow. The Franco-Prussian War was a direct consequence of the national consolidation that Napoleon had initiated. The First World War was fought across landscapes that Napoleon had traversed: the fields of Belgium, the rivers of northeastern France, the plains of Poland and Russia, by armies whose organizational principles descended from the reforms he had pioneered. The Second World War produced a figure, Hitler, who consciously modeled aspects of his self-presentation on Napoleon, who invaded Russia with the same catastrophic ambition, and who ended his career in a bunker rather than on a rock in the Atlantic, having produced a body count that made Napoleon's wars look, by comparison, almost modest. The comparison is instructive precisely because it breaks down. Napoleon was not Hitler. The equation, which has been made lazily by polemicists on multiple sides, collapses under examination. Napoleon was an authoritarian, not a totalitarian. He sought conquest, not extermination. His legal code was a document of rationality. Hitler's regime produced Auschwitz. The differences are fundamental, and conflating the two is both historically inaccurate and morally incoherent. But the comparison persists because it points to a real question. A question about the nature of concentrated power, about the relationship between military genius and political catastrophe, about what happens when a society entrusts its fate to a single extraordinary individual and discovers too late that the individual's judgment is not equal to the individual's gifts. Napoleon and Hitler are not the same answer to this question. They are, in some respects, the same question, posed at different volumes and with different consequences. The question has not been answered. It cannot be answered, because it is not really a question about Napoleon or about Hitler. It is a question about us, about the human susceptibility to the promise of greatness, about the willingness to trade freedom for competence, about the persistent, ineradicable hope that somewhere there exists a leader strong enough and smart enough and brave enough to cut through the complexity of collective life and simply make things work. Napoleon made things work, for a time. There is one more thing to say, and it requires a return to the island, not St. Helena. Corsica. Ajaccio in the 21st century is a small city of roughly 70,000 people, the capital of Corse du Sud, a French department that administers the southern half of the island. It is a pleasant place. The harbor is pretty, the old town is narrow and sun-washed. The cafes serve pastis and local cheese, and the air still carries on certain days the smell of maki drifting down from the hills. The Maison Bonaparte, the house on the Rue Saint-Charles where Letizia went into labor on that August day in 1769, is a museum now. You can walk through the rooms. You can see the furniture, or furniture that is said to be the original. You can stand in the room where he was supposedly born and look out the window at the narrow street below and try to imagine what it meant to be a child in this house, in this city, on this island. At that particular moment in the history of the world, you will fail. The imagination cannot bridge the gap. The distance between the Ajaccio of 1769 and the Ajaccio of today is not merely temporal, it is ontological. The world that produced Napoleon, a world without railroads, without telegraphs, without antibiotics, without democracy in any form that we would recognize, a world in which most human beings lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, and in which the idea that a Corsican boy might become the ruler of Europe was not improbable, but literally inconceivable. That world is gone, and no act of historical imagination can fully reconstruct it. What remains is the stone. The house is stone, the streets are stone, the harbor wall where fishing boats still tie up is stone. Corsica is an island of granite, and granite endures. The human drama that unfolded on this particular piece of granite, the birth, the departure, the transformation, the rise, the fall, the exile, the return, the final fall, has been absorbed into the stone the way all human drama is eventually absorbed. Silently, completely, without residue. Napoleon understood this, or at least, in his darker moments on St. Helena, he approached this understanding. What is history, he reportedly said, but a fable agreed upon? The remark is characteristically self-serving, a man whose own version of history was the most elaborate fable of all, dismissing the entire enterprise as fiction. But it contains a kernel of genuine insight. History is, in part, a story we tell ourselves about the past, and the story changes with every telling, and the past itself, the actual lived experience of actual human beings, recedes further with every generation until it becomes For all practical purposes, unrecoverable. We cannot recover Napoleon. We cannot know what he thought as he stood on the deck of the Northumberland watching St. Helena rise from the Atlantic like a verdict. We cannot know what he felt as he dictated his memoirs, reshaping his life into a narrative that would outlast his body. We cannot know whether, in the small hours of the night, in the damp rooms of Longwood House, he ever doubted, ever wondered whether the whole immense enterprise, the wars, the conquests, the crowning, the code, the million dead, had been worth it. Whether it had been, in the final accounting, anything more than the restless expenditure of an energy that could not be contained and could not be justified, only expressed, we cannot know. The sources do not reach that far. What we can know is what he left behind. And what he left behind is not a single thing but a world, the world we still inhabit, shaped by forces he set in motion, governed by laws he wrote or inspired, divided along borders he drew or erased, haunted by questions he raised and could not answer. The modern nation-state, with its centralized administration, its codified law, its professional bureaucracy, its conscript army, its public education system, this is, in significant part, Napoleon's creation, built on revolutionary foundations but given its enduring form by his administrative genius. The Europe of nations, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, each defined by language and culture and the memory of struggle, is a Europe that Napoleon's wars midwifed into being, however unintentionally. The global order that emerged from the wreckage of the 20th century's wars still bears, beneath its surface, the imprint of choices made in the first years of the 19th. When a young general from Corsica looked at the map of the world and decided it was not yet arranged to his satisfaction, these are not small things. They are the architecture of modernity, and they were designed to begin, or at least catalyzed, by a mind that operated at a speed and a scale that few human beings have matched, before or since. But the architecture was built at a cost that the architect never paid. The cost was paid by the conscript dying of typhus on the road to Smolensk, by the Spanish farmer watching his house burn, by the Egyptian prisoner on the beach at Jaffa, by the 17-year-old Marie-Louise, given to a man she had never met to seal a peace between empires, by the women of every country Napoleon's armies crossed, whose experiences the sources do not record and whose suffering the legend does not acknowledge, by the enslaved people of Haiti, whose revolution Napoleon attempted to crush, sending his brother-in-law Leclerc with 20,000 troops to reimpose slavery on a people who had freed themselves, a campaign that failed catastrophically, that cost France its most profitable colony, and that represents perhaps the most morally unambiguous defeat of Napoleon's career, though it is the one least often mentioned in the surveys of his achievements. The Haitian Revolution succeeded not because Napoleon was merciful, but because the people of Saint-Domingue refused to submit, and because yellow fever killed French soldiers faster than Toussaint Louverture's armies could. Napoleon's attempt to restore slavery in the Caribbean, signed into law in 1802, reversed only decades later, is the shadow passage that many tellings of his story prefer to omit, because it complicates the narrative of the enlightened modernizer, the rational lawgiver, the man who carried the revolution's principles across Europe. He carried them selectively. He applied them where they served his interests and discarded them where they did not. The rights of man, as Napoleon interpreted them, were not universal. They were European, and even within Europe they were conditional. This is not a reason to dismiss Napoleon. It is a reason to see him clearly, to hold the code and the colony, the battle and the body count, the genius and the cost, in a single frame of vision and refuse to let either cancel the other. The afternoon light in the Invalides in Paris falls through the dome in a way that was calculated by the architects to produce a specific effect. The light descends in a column, golden, almost theatrical, and it strikes the dark red porphyry of the sarcophagus with a warmth that the stone does not return. The crypt is cool. The silence is institutional. The silence of a museum, not of a grave. Tourists lean over the balustrade and look down. Some take photographs, some read the inscriptions on the floor, which name the battles: Rivoli, the pyramids, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram, the Moskwa. The names are beautiful. They are also, each of them, the name of a place where thousands of people died. Napoleon lies below, encased in 6 nested coffins: tin, mahogany, lead, ebony, lead again, oak, sealed inside the great stone sarcophagus that rests on a base of green granite. The body within has been enclosed for nearly 2 centuries. Whatever remains of the man, the bones, the uniform, the decorations, the physical residue of 51 years of life, exists now in darkness, in silence, in the center of a monument that was built not to honor a person, but to sustain a legend. The legend persists. It persists because it answers a need that has not diminished. The need to believe that history is not merely the accumulation of accident and inertia, that individual will can matter, that a person born with nothing, armed with nothing but ability and nerve, can reshape the conditions of existence for millions. This is a dangerous belief. It is also, in some form, a necessary one. Without it, the entire project of human agency, the idea that what we do matters, that our choices have consequences, that the future is not fixed, loses its foundation. Napoleon is the test case. He is the proof and the warning, the demonstration and the cautionary tale. He showed what one mind can build. He showed what one mind can destroy. He showed that these are often the same act viewed from different angles, and that the angle from which you view them determines not the truth, but only which part of the truth you are able to see. 200 years after his death, the argument continues. It will continue after this telling is finished. It will continue because the questions Napoleon raises are not historical questions. They are human ones, and human questions do not have historical solutions. They have only the endless, unresolvable negotiation between what we admire and what we deplore, between what we wish to build and what we are willing to pay, between the world we inherit and the world we choose to make. The maquis still grows on the hills above Ajaccio. It is the same maquis, rosemary, myrtle, wild lavender, that scented the air on the morning Letizia walked home from church and felt the first contractions of a labor that would produce the most consequential child of the 18th century. The plant does not know this. The hillside does not remember. The stone house on the Rue Saint-Charles stands in the Mediterranean sun, its walls thick and cool, holding the night's chill long into the afternoon, exactly as they did on the 15th of August, 1769, when a woman who was 19 years old brought a small, dark-haired boy into a world that did not yet know it was waiting for him. The world was not waiting. The world does not wait. It simply continues, and the people who pass through it leave what marks they can, and the marks endure or they do not, and the stone remains. The stone always remains.